Tonight, we're going to step back in time to one of history's most defining periods, the Great War, World War I. But we won't be discussing grand strategies or political maneuvering. Instead, we'll walk quietly through the lived experiences of those who found themselves caught in humanity's first truly modern conflict. But first, I want to thank you for being here tonight. It means a lot that you're here, allowing my voice to keep you company in this calm space before sleep. If you'd like to support this journey, a like, a comment, or a quiet subscription can help keep the candle burning. Just a small gesture, but deeply appreciated. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments which historical era would you visit if you could dream yourself there tonight. Let your imagination wander, and let's collect these night travels one by one. This is Educational Bedtime, where the stories are long, the tone stays soft, and the past unfolds slowly, like parchment beneath candlelight. The year is 1914, and the world is about to change forever. But first, let us descend into the earth itself, into the maze of trenches that became home to millions of young men who never imagined they would spend months, even years, living underground like human moles. Breathe deeply and let yourself sink into this story of survival, suffering, and the enduring human spirit. Chapter 1. Why you wouldn't last a week in a WWI trench. Imagine yourself stepping off a transport truck on a grey October morning in 1916, the ground beneath your feet squelching with each step, releasing the smell of damp earth mixed with something far more unsettling. You're about to descend into your new home, a narrow, zigzagging trench that stretches as far as the eye can see in both directions. The first thing that strikes you is the sound, or rather the layered symphony of sounds that will become the soundtrack to your existence. There's the distant rumble of artillery, constant and rhythmic like thunder that never quite fades. Closer, you hear the soft splash of boots moving through water, the scrape of shovels against earth, and the quiet conversations of men who speak in whispers, as if raising their voices might invite death itself to pay attention. Your new home is roughly 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, carved from the Belgian countryside with the desperate efficiency of men who know their lives depend on how well they can disappear into the earth. The walls are reinforced with sandbags, wooden planks, and whatever materials could be scavenged from the surrounding farmland. Every few yards, the trench zigs or zags, a design meant to prevent enemy shells from causing massive casualties along straight lines. This zigzag pattern, known as a traverse system, ensures that if a shell does land directly in your trench, or if enemy soldiers manage to break through, they cannot simply fire straight down the entire length, killing everyone in a single sweep. The engineering is both ingenious and desperate, born from the harsh lessons learned in the early months of the war, when men died by the thousands due to poor defensive planning. The construction of these trenches represents one of the most massive earthworks projects in human history. The trench systems on the Western Front were roughly 75 miles long, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps, although not in a continuous line. Each section has been dug by hand, shovel by shovel, by men who never imagined they would become human moles, living underground for months at a time. The earth you now call home has been turned over and over again, first by German spades, then by British and French tools, and sometimes by enemy shells that blast craters which are then incorporated into the defensive system. Your day begins at 4 a.m. with the ritual known as Stand To. In the grey pre-dawn darkness, you climb onto the firing step, your rifle ready, peering into the wasteland that stretches between your trench and the enemy's. This is no man's land, a moonscape of shell craters, tangled barbed wire, and the remnants of previous battles. For 1 hour you stand perfectly still, watching for any sign of an enemy attack, your breath visible in the cold morning air. The silence during Stand To is profound and terrifying. At every small sound, the clink of metal on metal, the shuffle of a boot, seems amplified in the stillness. You learn to breathe quietly, to move with deliberate slowness, to become part of the landscape itself. This hour feels eternal, and yet it passes too quickly, because with the growing light comes the knowledge that you are now visible to enemy snipers across the way. The firing step, a raised platform built into the front wall of the trench, becomes your observation post and your potential execution ground. It's exactly the right height to allow you to peer over the parapet while still providing some protection. But standing on it makes you visible to enemy marksmen who have spent months learning every angle, every shadow, every possible target along your section of the line, and German snipers, many of them hunters and marksmen before the war, have turned killing into a precise science. They know exactly where your head will appear, they've measured the distances, and they wait with the patience of predators for someone to make a mistake. One moment of carelessness, 1 second too long above the parapet, and your war is over. As dawn fully breaks, you climb down from the firing step and begin the day's work. But first, there's the matter of breakfast, if you can call it that. Your rations consist of hardtack biscuits so tough they could be used as ammunition, tinned meat that may or may not be edible, and tea that tastes of metal and hope. By 1918, the British were sending over 67 million pelts, 30 million kilojoules of meat to the Western Front each month. But what reaches you in the frontline trenches often bears little resemblance to actual food. The biscuits, officially known as hardtack, are so hard that soldiers have developed elaborate methods for making them edible. Some soak them in tea until they soften into a mushy paste, others smash them with rifle butts, and mix the crumbs with whatever liquid is available. The tinned meat, universally known as bully beef, comes in rectangular cans that soldiers learn to open with bayonets, revealing a substance that may once have been beef, but now resembles grey paste mixed with fat. You eat standing in several inches of water, because the trenches are always wet, always slowly filling with the water that seeps through the earth above. The water is not clean, it carries with it all the detritus of war, fragments of equipment, pieces of clothing and things you prefer not to think about. Yet this is the same water that will soak through your boots, that will turn your socks into breeding grounds for infection, that will slowly rot the skin from your feet if you cannot find a way to stay dry. Constant exposure to wetness caused trench foot, a painful condition in which dead tissue spread across one or both feet, sometimes requiring amputation. The medical officers have learned to recognize the early signs, the pale, swollen skin that marks the beginning of tissue death. But prevention is nearly impossible when you're standing in water for weeks at a time. After your meager breakfast, the real work begins. Trenches require constant maintenance, and maintenance means exposing yourself to enemy fire. You spend hours reinforcing walls that have collapsed during the night's shelling, digging new drainage ditches that will fill with water before the day is over, and repairing the duckboards, wooden planks that provide the only solid footing in your waterlogged world. These duckboards, when they can be obtained, are precious commodities. They keep you slightly above the standing water, providing a semblance of dry footing that can mean the difference between healthy feet and infected stumps. But duckboards are also targets. Enemy shells fragment them into splinters, and the constant passage of men wearing heavy boots wears them out quickly. The work is backbreaking, performed while crouched low to avoid sniper fire. Your back aches constantly from the unnatural position, and your hands, even in gloves, become raw and cracked from the constant moisture and rough work. Every movement must be calculated, every tool passed carefully from hand to hand, because the enemy is always watching, always waiting for someone to make a mistake. A shovel blade catching the morning light might draw a sniper's bullet. A man standing too tall while filling sandbags might become a casualty statistic. The constant vigilance required for simple tasks becomes mentally exhausting, adding another layer of stress to an already unbearable situation. During the day, you cannot stand upright in most parts of the trench. The parapet, the front wall of your trench, is designed to be just high enough to protect you while crouching, but stand too tall and you present a target to the German snipers who have spent months learning every angle, every shadow, every possible opportunity along your section of the line. These enemy marksmen are not random soldiers pressed into service. Many are experienced hunters who learned their skills tracking deer and wild boar in the forests of Bavaria and Prussia. They've adapted those skills to hunting men, and they're very good at it. They know that you'll need to move during the day, that you'll have to expose yourself to repair the trench, to observe the enemy positions, to perform the hunt and small tasks that keep your section of the line functioning. They wait for those moments with the patience of professional hunters. As the days pass, you become intimately acquainted with your new companions, and they are not your fellow soldiers. The rats are your most persistent roommates, enormous rats, fat with human flesh, as one soldier described them. There are estimations that show it is possible there were more rats than soldiers in trenches. These creatures have grown fat and bold on the abundance of food that war provides. They are enormous, some the size of cats, and they have lost all fear of humans. They scurry across your feet as you try to sleep, steal food from your hands as you eat, and seem to appear from nowhere whenever you let your guard down. One pair of rats can produce 80 offspring in a year, and in the perfect breeding environment of the trenches, they multiply at an astounding rate. The trenches provide everything rats need to thrive: shelter from the weather, abundant food in the form of human rations, and worse, standing water to drink, and countless hiding places in the maze of dugouts and communication trenches. The environment in the trenches was optimal for a rat's breeding ground, with an abundance of corpses, food, shelter, water, and waste. The rats were able to breed quickly. They've adapted to life in the trenches with remarkable efficiency, learning to avoid the areas where shells typically land, to hide during artillery bombardments, and to emerge when the danger passes. These rats have developed an intelligence that borders on the supernatural. They know when incoming shells are about to land, often scurrying for cover seconds before the explosions. Some soldiers swear the rats are better than any early warning system, and they learn to watch their movements for signs of incoming danger. Veterans tell stories of entire rat populations disappearing minutes before a major artillery bombardment, only to return when the shelling stops. Whether this is true or simply the desperate hope of men looking for any sign that might help them survive, the rats certainly seem to possess survival instincts that surpass those of their human cohabitants. But the rats are not your only companions. Lice were a constant problem for soldiers living in the cramped and crowded conditions of the trenches. These tiny creatures find their way into every fold of your clothing, every seam of your uniform. Lice were a never-ending problem, breeding in the seams of filthy clothing and causing men to itch unceasingly. They bite constantly, creating an itching that becomes a form of torture. You spend your few free moments picking them from your clothes, but for every one you remove, 10 more seem to take its place. The itching becomes so constant that you stop noticing it, the same way you stop noticing the smell of unwashed bodies and stagnant water. Even when clothing was periodically washed and deloused, lice eggs invariably remained hidden in the seams, within a few hours of the clothes being reworn. The body heat generated would cause the eggs to hatch. This makes delousing a Sisyphean task, endlessly repeated, but never completed. Soldiers develop a practice called chatting, which involves crushing lice between fingernails or burning them out with cigarette ends and candles. More than 1 million troops were infected with trench fever during World War I, with each affected soldier unfit for duty for more than 60 days. Lice caused trench fever, a particularly painful disease that began suddenly with severe pain followed by high fever. The connection between lice and trench fever wasn't discovered until 1918, but the symptoms were unmistakable: sudden onset of severe headaches, high fever, and muscle pain that left men incapacitated for months. The smell of the trenches is something that words struggle to capture, but it becomes as much a part of your existence as breathing itself. It begins with the mud, thick, clinging earth that has been churned and rechurned by thousands of feet, mixed with rainwater that has no place to drain. The mud in Belgium varies in consistency from water to about the thickness of dough, ready for the oven, one British infantry soldier wrote. This creates a smell that is earthy and organic, but also somehow dead, as if the very ground has given up the struggle to support life. Layered on top of this base note are the smells of human habitation compressed into impossible conditions. There's the smell of unwashed bodies. Soap and hot water are luxuries that don't exist in the trenches. Men go for weeks without washing, their clothes becoming stiff with dirt, sweat, worse, stinking mud mingled with rotting corpses, lingering gas, open latrines, wet clothes and unwashed bodies to produce an overpowering stench. There's the smell of the latrines, crude holes dug at the ends of communication trenches, where privacy is impossible and sanitation is a distant dream. The main latrines were located behind the lines, but frontline soldiers had to dig small waste pits in their own trenches. But underneath all of these familiar, if unpleasant smells, is something else, something that makes your stomach turn and your mind recoil. It's the smell of death, of bodies that lie in no man's land, where they cannot be retrieved, slowly returning to the earth under the open sky. This smell seeps into your clothes, your hair, your very skin, until you carry it with you always, a reminder of what awaits those who are unlucky or careless. The dead in no man's land become part of the landscape, their remains scattered by shells, picked at by rats, slowly decomposing in the open air. Sometimes, when the wind is right, the smell becomes so overwhelming that men vomit, adding their own contribution to the cocktail of odors that defines trench life. Perhaps nothing defines trench life more completely than the water. It seeps through the earth above, pools in every depression, and turns the bottom of every trench into a shallow stream. Your boots are never dry, and after a few days, you stop remembering what dry feet feel like. Many troops succumb to trench foot, a fungal infection caused by immersion in cold water. The constant moisture creates its own problems. Trench foot, a condition where the skin of your feet literally begins to rot away, turning black and peeling off in sheets. Trench foot was a fungal infection of the feet, caused by cold, wet and unsanitary trench conditions. It could turn gangrenous and result in amputation. You learn to sleep sitting up, leaning against the trench wall, because lying down means lying in water. You learn to eat, standing up, because there is no dry place to sit. You learn to perform every bodily function while standing in water, because the alternative is to climb out of the trench and expose yourself to enemy fire. The water carries with it all the detritus of war. Fragments of equipment, pieces of clothing and things you prefer not to think about, float past your feet as you try to go about your daily routine. You become skilled at ignoring these reminders, at focusing on the simple task of survival from one moment to the next. The water in the trenches is not simply rainwater. It's a complex mixture that includes runoff from shell craters, seepage from underground springs, and drainage from the countless temporary ponds that dot no man's land. When shells explode, they create craters that fill with water, creating a network of small lakes across the battlefield. This water, contaminated with cordite, metal fragments and decomposing organic matter, eventually finds its way into the trench system. Pumps are sometimes available to remove standing water, but they're constantly breaking down, and the water returns faster than it can be removed. The soundscape of the trenches is as complex as it is terrifying. There's the constant background noise of the war itself, the rumble of artillery miles away, the crack of rifles, the whistle of bullets passing overhead. But there are also the more intimate sounds of survival, the soft splash of feet moving through water, the scrape of shovels against earth, the quiet conversations of men who have learned to speak without raising their voices. You learn to interpret these sounds with the precision of a musician reading sheet music. The whistle of an incoming shell tells you not just that danger is approaching, but from which direction and approximately where it will land. The crack of a sniper's rifle tells you whether the shot was aimed at your section of trench or someone else's. The sound of rats scurrying tells you whether they're fleeing from something dangerous or simply going about their business. At night, the sounds become more acute, more frightening. Every small noise might be an enemy patrol, attempting to cross no man's land. Every creak of wood might be the sound of someone climbing into your trench. You learn to sleep with one ear, always listening, always ready to wake at the first sign of danger. Sleep becomes a series of brief dozes, never deep enough to be truly restful, always interrupted by the sounds of war or the discomfort of your sleeping position. Charles Quinnell found out. You slept by sitting on the fire step. You'd try and find a dry sandbag to sit on, and you'd sit there you'd put your overcoat over your head and try and make a tent of it, and you'd huddle down under that, just sitting down. But it was a very, very broken sleep. The artillery creates its own vocabulary of terror. You learn to distinguish between the different types of shells by their sound. High explosive shells make a particular whining noise as they approach, followed by the earth-shaking crash of their detonation. Shrapnel shells burst in the air, sending thousands of metal balls whizzing through the space above your head. Gas shells make almost no sound, their deadly cargo released with nothing more than a soft pop, making them the most feared of all artillery rounds. Machine gun fire creates a distinctive chattering sound, rapid bursts that can sweep across no man's land in seconds, cutting down anything in their path. In the brief moments when you're not working, not standing guard, not trying to sleep, you write letters home. These letters are perhaps the most difficult part of your existence in the trenches, because they require you to construct an elaborate fiction. You cannot tell your family about the rats, the lice, the constant fear, the smell of death that follows you everywhere. Instead, you write about the camaraderie of your fellow soldiers, about the food which you describe as adequate, about the weather which you describe as challenging but manageable. You write these letters by candlelight, crouched in a corner of the trench, using a piece of wooden board as a desk. The paper becomes damp almost immediately, and you must write quickly before the moisture makes the ink run. You fold these letters carefully, place them in envelopes that you hope will somehow find their way across the war-torn continent to reach the people you love. But even as you write these cheerful lies, you know that your family is writing similar letters to you. They write about normal life continuing, about neighbors and friends, about small daily occurrences that seem to belong to a different world entirely. Whenever their letters reach you, you read them over and over, trying to remember what it felt like to worry about ordinary things, to live in a world where the biggest concern might be whether it would rain on washing day. Their letters speak of concerns so trivial compared to your daily reality that they might as well be messages from another planet. Yet these same letters provide your only connection to the world you left behind, the world you hope to return to if you survive this hell. Your mother writes about the garden, how the roses are blooming despite the late frost, how she's planted vegetables this year to help with the war effort. Your father mentions problems with the roof tiles, how he's been meaning to fix them, but keeps putting it off. Your sister describes her work in the munitions factory, though the censors have removed any details that might be considered sensitive. These domestic concerns, so ordinary and peaceful, seem like fairy tales to someone whose greatest worry is whether the next shell will land close enough to bury him alive. The contrast between the letters you receive and the letters you write creates a strange double existence. And in your replies you become an actor playing the role of a soldier having an adventure, rather than a man slowly being destroyed by circumstances beyond his imagination. You write about learning French from the local civilians, though the only French you've learned consists of curse words and pleas for food. You mention the interesting historical sites you've seen, though the only history you encounter is the fresh destruction of centuries-old buildings by artillery fire. You describe the character-building aspects of military life, while carefully avoiding any mention of the ways in which the war is systematically stripping away your humanity. As the weeks pass, you begin to change in ways that you don't immediately recognize. Your body adapts to the constant discomfort, the irregular sleep, the poor nutrition. You lose weight, but you also gain a kind of wiry strength that comes from constant physical labor and the need to remain alert at all times. Your hands become permanently stained with mud, and worse, and your fingernails, despite your best efforts, remain black with the earth you've been digging. The calluses on your palms grow thick from constant shoveling, and your back develops a permanent stoop from months of moving in a crouch. But the changes go deeper than the physical. You learn to sleep through artillery bombardments that would have terrified you when you first arrived. You learn to eat while standing in water, to have conversations while listening for the sound of incoming shells, to perform complex tasks while crouching in positions that would have been impossible to maintain for more than a few minutes in your previous life. To develop what soldiers call the 1,000-yard stare, a way of looking that sees everything and nothing, that is always scanning for danger, while trying not to see too much of the horror that surrounds you. Most significantly, you learn to exist in a state of constant alertness that never quite becomes normal, but becomes familiar. Every muscle in your body learns to be ready to react instantly. Every sense becomes attuned to the subtle signs that might mean the difference between life and death. You can tell the difference between friendly and enemy artillery by the sound alone. You know instinctively when it's safe to move and when you should freeze in place. You develop an almost supernatural awareness of your surroundings, a hypervigilance that will stay with you long after the war ends, assuming you survive to see its conclusion. You learn the arithmetic of war with a precision that would have amazed your school teachers. You can calculate the trajectory of incoming shells by their sound, estimate the distance to enemy positions by the crack of their rifles, and determine the safety of any given position by measuring sight lines and angles of fire. These calculations become as automatic as breathing, performed without conscious thought, dozens of times each day. You know exactly how long you can safely remain above the parapet, how quickly you can move from one position to another, how much noise you can make without attracting unwanted attention. The psychological adaptation required for trench warfare is perhaps more remarkable than the physical changes. You learn to compartmentalize your mind, to shut away the parts of yourself that remember safety, comfort, and normalcy. Those aspects of your personality become luxuries you cannot afford, distractions that might get you killed. You develop a grim sense of humor that would horrify civilians, joking about death and destruction in ways that help you cope with the constant presence of both. You learn to find entertainment in the smallest things: a dry cigarette, a letter from home, a few minutes of sleep without being awakened by artillery fire. But there are other calculations that are more difficult to perform. You learn to count the days since you've been dry, since you've had a hot meal, since you've slept for more than 2 hours at a time. You learn to calculate the odds of survival, your own and those of the men around you. You keep mental tallies of friends who have been killed, wounded, or transferred to other units. You estimate how much longer your supplies will last, how many more days you can endure before something inside you simply gives up. And, always, there is the calculation that you try not to make but cannot avoid. How many of your friends are still alive? How many have been transferred to other units? How many have simply disappeared during the night raids and morning bombardments that are the constant reality of trench warfare? The routine of trench life becomes both monotonous and terrifying. Days blend into one another, marked only by the regular schedule of stand-to, work details, and guard duty. Yet, within this routine, sudden bursts of violence can erupt without warning. A quiet morning of routine maintenance can be shattered by an artillery bombardment that buries men alive or tears them apart. An uneventful afternoon can be interrupted by a sniper's bullet that kills a man who made the mistake of exposing himself for a fraction of a second too long. The combination of boredom and terror creates a unique form of psychological stress that wears away at men's minds, as surely as the constant moisture wears away at their feet. James Pratt served with the Gordon Highlanders on the Western Front in 1915. The average day in the ordinary bit of the trenches was just by the way doing nothing, except perhaps filling a few sandbags to strengthen a bit of the parapet of the trench. But of course there had to be always somebody on sentry go all the time, on each section of the trench. This combination of tedium and vigilance creates its own form of exhaustion. Your mind craves stimulation to break the monotony, but you dare not let your guard down even for a moment. The result is a constant state of alert boredom, where you're simultaneously understimulated and overstressed. The food situation in the trenches deserves special attention, not just because of its poor quality, but because of the psychological impact of eating badly while risking your life. Harold Mayhall of the Durham Light Infantry didn't have the best memories of his Western Front diet. Oh, that's a sore point. Rations were very poor. The daily rations, when they arrive, often consist of the same few items repeated endlessly. Hardtack biscuits that require soaking to become edible, tinned meat of uncertain origin and dubious nutritional value, and tea that provides warmth and caffeine, but little else. Occasionally there might be jam, usually plum and apple, which becomes precious enough to fight over. Fresh bread is a luxury reserved for special occasions, or for those fortunate enough to be rotated back to reserve trenches. Ernest Jones, who served in Salonika, recalled how food was issued to the large numbers of frontline troops. Sometimes you'd go down if they'd bring it to the end of the trench, you see, because there were different communication trenches coming in, you see, and you'd go to the end and help to carry the things, and then the orderly man would distribute them, you see. The distribution of food becomes a complex logistical operation, with men risking their lives to carry rations forward from the supply dumps to the front lines. The supply runs typically happen at night, when the cover of darkness provides some protection from enemy observation, but even then, shells and bullets can turn a routine food delivery into a deadly mission. The cigarette ration takes on an importance far beyond its actual nutritional value. Cigarette ration was, I think, 40 every fortnight. Flag cigarettes they were, wood bar. I didn't smoke many because I used to save mine and swap it for food with the chaps that really went mad for cigarettes for a smoke. Tobacco becomes a currency traded for food, favors, or other small luxuries that make life slightly more bearable. But for many men, a cigarette provides the only moments of pleasure in an otherwise hellish existence. The ritual of lighting up, the few minutes of calm smoking can become psychologically essential for maintaining sanity in an insane situation. The rum ration, when available, serves a similar psychological function. They'd measure this out and you'd have to drink it while you was before him. But I couldn't drink mine. It was too strong, because I never drank. I used to keep mine for my tea. The daily tot of rum, distributed under the watchful eye of an officer to prevent hoarding or trading, provides both physical warmth and psychological fortification. For some men it's the only thing that allows them to face another day in the trenches. For others, like the soldier quoted above, it becomes a way to improve the taste of other rations, a small attempt to maintain some semblance of civilized dining in utterly uncivilized conditions. The medical challenges of trench life extend far beyond the obvious dangers of enemy fire. Disease becomes as deadly an enemy as any German soldier. Infection resulted in more casualties than war-related wounds during World War I. The unsanitary conditions, the constant moisture, the close quarters and the poor nutrition create an environment where illness spreads rapidly and proves difficult to treat. Dysentery becomes a constant threat, turning simple digestion into a painful ordeal. Respiratory infections spread from man to man in the confined spaces of the trenches, sapping strength and will when both are already in short supply. Trench mouth, a type of gum infection, was also problematic and is thought to be associated with the stress of non-stop bombardment. This condition, caused by poor oral hygiene and psychological stress, results in painful bleeding gums and loose teeth. Men who survive bullets and shells find themselves unable to eat properly because their mouths are too infected and painful to chew food. The irony is devastating to be slowly starving because you cannot process the inadequate food that's available to you. Chapter 2. The Christmas Truce of 1914. When enemies became brothers. As we move from the daily grinding reality of trench life, let us journey to a moment that defied all logic, all military protocol, and all expectations of what war should be. It is December 24th, 1914, and something extraordinary is about to unfold across the Western Front, something so unexpected that military commanders would spend years trying to ensure it never happened again. The winter of 1914 had been particularly harsh, for the war that everyone predicted would be over by Christmas was now entering its 5th month, and Christmas was arriving with the men still deep in their muddy trenches. The festive season that should have found these young soldiers around dinner tables instead found them huddled in frozen dugouts, sharing tinned meat and stale bread with rats and lice. By December 1914, the reality of trench warfare had settled in, and weeks of heavy rain had turned both the trenches and the no-man's land that separated them into a cold, muddy morass. For those on the Western Front, daily life was miserable, but it was a misery that was shared by enemies who were, in some places, separated by 50 yards, 46 meters or less. The proximity between the opposing forces had created a strange intimacy, where soldiers could hear each other's daily routines, the sound of meal preparation, the voices of men talking, singing, even snoring at night. This closeness had bred a peculiar familiarity that official military doctrine had never anticipated nor prepared for. The idea of a ceasefire during the holiday was proposed by Pope Benedict XV on the 7th of December. "I ask that the guns may fall silent at least on the day the angels sang." His request was officially ignored by the leaders of the partaking nations, but it may have been inspiration for soldiers to schedule their own truces. The Pope's appeal had reached the trenches through letters from home, newspaper reports, and the informal communication networks that soldiers maintained despite official censorship. While the high command of all nations rejected the papal plea, it planted a seed in the minds of men who were far from home during the most sacred time of the Christian calendar. On this Christmas Eve, something began to stir in the German trenches opposite the British lines near Ypres. It started as a single voice, tentative and uncertain, cutting through the usual sounds of war. The German soldier, perhaps homesick, perhaps simply moved by the memory of Christmases past, began to sing, "O Tannenbaum, O Christmas tree." The melody drifted across no man's land, that deadly space between the trenches where so many men had fallen, and where no living soul was supposed to venture. For a moment, the British soldiers in their trenches simply listened, perhaps wondering if this was some new form of psychological warfare, some trick designed to lower their guard. Late on Christmas Eve 1914, men of the British Expeditionary Force BEF heard German troops in the trenches opposite them, singing carols and patriotic songs, and saw lanterns and small fir trees along their trenches. The sight of these small Christmas trees, decorated with candles and placed along the German parapets, created an almost surreal scene. Here, in the midst of a battlefield where death was a constant companion, were symbols of peace, hope, and celebration. The candles flickered in the cold night air, casting shadows that danced across the muddy landscape, transforming the hellish environment into something that briefly resembled a Christmas scene. But then, something magical happened. A British voice picked up the melody, not with the German words, but with the familiar English lyrics of "O Christmas Tree." Soon, other voices joined in, and the song became a bridge across the wasteland that separated enemies who had been trying to kill each other for months. Messages began to be shouted between the trenches. The initial exchanges were tentative, calls of Merry Christmas echoing across no man's land in accented English and broken German. Some soldiers called out questions about the enemy's welfare, asking if they had enough food, if they were cold, treating their enemies as fellow human beings rather than targets to be eliminated. The singing continued as darkness fell on Christmas Eve. German voices offered "Still an Act," "Silent Night," and British voices responded with their own Christmas carols. The trenches, which had been filled with the sounds of war for so long, now resonated with melodies that spoke of peace, of home, of the hope that had somehow survived in the hearts of men who had seen too much death. Imagine yourself in those trenches, listening to these voices rising in the cold December air. The same voices that had been shouting warnings about incoming shells, that had been calling for stretcher bearers, that had been crying out in pain and fear, were now lifted in songs that their mothers had taught them, songs that reminded them of who they had been before the war tried to turn them into killing machines. 2nd Lieutenant Alfred Dugan Chatter of the 2nd Battalion, Gordon Highlanders, was writing to his mother from his dugout that Christmas Eve. There. I am writing this in the trenches in my dugout, with a wood fire going, and plenty of straw. It is rather cozy, although it is freezing hard and real Christmas weather, he wrote. His letter, composed in 2 parts over Christmas Day and December 27th, would become one of the most famous first-hand accounts of the Christmas truce. There. Chatter wrote with the careful observation of a trained officer, but also with the wonder of a young man witnessing something unprecedented in the history of warfare. As Christmas morning dawned, the singing gave way to something even more remarkable. A few brave souls, on both sides, began to emerge from their trenches. They came tentatively at first, hands raised to show they carried no weapons, moving slowly across the scarred earth of no man's land. Chatter described the moment when he first saw movement in the German trenches. About 10 o'clock this morning I was peeping over the parapet when I saw a German, waving his arms, and presently 2 of them got out of their trench and came towards ours. The sight of unarmed enemy soldiers walking across the battlefield must have been almost impossible to comprehend for men who had spent months learning to see Germans as targets rather than human beings. We were just going to fire on them when we saw they had no rifles. So one of our men went to meet them, and, in about 2 minutes, the ground between the 2 lines of trenches was swarming with men and officers of both sides, shaking hands and wishing each other a happy Christmas. Chater continued. The transformation from hostile confrontation to friendly greeting happened with startling speed. What makes the Truce of 1914 so surprising is that it was not one truce, but many. Dozens of impromptu truces sprung up across the front, involving over 100,000 soldiers. Other truces occurred spontaneously along a significant portion of the 47-5-mile Western Front, each one arising independently as local commanders and soldiers made their own decisions about how to spend Christmas Day. The first meetings were awkward, uncertain. These men had spent months learning to see each other as enemies, as targets to be eliminated. Now they stood face to face, and what they saw were not the monsters that propaganda had painted, but young men much like themselves, cold, tired, homesick, and surprisingly relieved to be able to stand upright without fear of being shot. Saxon troops, in particular, were credited with initiating a dialogue with the British. Soldiers on both sides regarded the Saxons as amiable and trustworthy, and the Christmas truce had the most success in areas where British troops faced Saxon regiments. The cultural connections between the Saxon Germans and their British cousins created a foundation for communication that transcended national boundaries. There was no ingrained animosity between the Germans and English. Much like a young Australian backpacker may travel overseas to work, it was common for young Germans to visit England. The Germans considered the English their Anglo-Saxon cousins. Many German soldiers had worked in England before the war, as waiters, cooks, barbers, and in other service industries. Some spoke English better than many of the British soldiers they now faced across no man's land. This shared cultural background made the initial conversations possible, as men discovered they had worked in the same cities, knew the same streets, even frequented the same pubs and restaurants. The initial exchanges were simple: cigarettes offered and accepted, chocolate shared, water exchanged. These were the universal currencies of soldiers, small comforts that transcended national boundaries and military allegiances. A British soldier might offer a tin of bully beef, while a German soldier shared his black bread. Neither was particularly appetizing, but both were offered with genuine generosity. The act of sharing food, even poor-quality military rations, carried deep symbolic meaning. In mixed cultures, sharing a meal represents friendship, trust, and mutual respect. For soldiers who had been trying to kill each other, the simple act of eating together represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. As the morning progressed, the interactions became more personal, more human. Soldiers who had been trying to kill each other began to share photographs of their families, their sweethearts, their homes. A German soldier might show a picture of his wife and children, while a British soldier shared a snapshot of his parents standing in front of their cottage. These exchanges were conducted largely in broken English, fragmented German, and the universal language of gestures and smiles. Men who had never traveled more than a few miles from their villages found themselves communicating with people from foreign lands, discovering that their hopes and fears were remarkably similar. Some soldiers exchanged addresses, promising to visit each other after the war ended. Others traded military insignia, buttons, and other small souvenirs. A German soldier might offer a brass button from his uniform in exchange for a British cap badge, each item becoming a memento of this impossible day when the war simply stopped. Koto wrote about these exchanges with obvious fascination. "We exchanged cigarettes and autographs, and some more people took photos," he noted. The mention of photographs is particularly significant, as these images would provide some of the most compelling evidence that the Christmas truce actually occurred. These photographs were taken on personal cameras that some soldiers had taken with them into the trenches. The photography in the trenches was discouraged for obvious reasons, but during the Christmas truce of 1914, soldiers on both sides of the trenches could not resist the opportunity to document such a unique event. In 2016, IWM was contacted by the family of one of the soldiers shown in this photograph. "We now know that this is Arno Bohm, a German soldier, standing alongside British troops from the London Rifle Brigade." The discovery of Arno Bohm's identity decades later demonstrates how these personal connections transcended the immediate moment, creating lasting bonds that families would remember and treasure long after the war ended. Perhaps the most famous aspect of the Christmas truce was the football matches that broke out spontaneously in several locations along the front. These were not organized games with formal rules, but rather impromptu kickabouts using whatever could serve as a ball. Sometimes an actual football that had been sent from home, sometimes a tin can, sometimes a bundle of rags tied together. Ernie Williams, a 19-year-old private with the 6th Battalion Cheshire Regiment, described how, from somewhere, somehow, this football appeared. His account, recorded decades later by the Imperial War Museum, captures the spontaneous nature of these games. They took their coats off, some of them, and put them down as goalposts. Williams said of the Germans, "There would be at least a couple of hundred taking part. No referee. We didn't need a referee for that kind of game. It was like playing as a kid in the streets, kicking the ball about, and the referee being the policeman and chasing you off. There was no score, no tally at all. It was simply a melee." The games were played on ground that had been fought over for months, where shell craters provided natural hazards and barbed wire marked the boundaries. The goals were often marked by items of clothing or equipment, and the teams were mixed in ways that would have been unthinkable just days before. Imagine the surreal nature of these matches. German soldiers and British soldiers playing together, laughing when someone stumbled into a shell crater, cheering when a particularly good shot was made. The same men who had been calculating firing angles and plotting each other's destruction were now arguing about whether a shot had crossed the goal line. At another spot along the front, a group of Scottish soldiers marked a goal with their hats and played against the Germans with huge enthusiasm, until a German officer found out about the game and put a stop to it, with the Germans leading 3. These games lasted only briefly, usually no more than an hour or two, but they created memories that would last lifetimes. For a few precious moments the war became something else entirely, a playground where young men could remember what it felt like to play, to laugh, to be simply human. However, historians have debated the extent and nature of these football matches. There is very little first-hand evidence of organized games taking place in the form we would recognize as a match, i.e., even sides, referee, rules, laid-out goals, etc. noted military historian Mike Hill. What is certain is that footballs appeared in no man's land, and men from both sides participated in informal games that resembled street football more than organized matches. The truth of the accounts has been disputed by some historians, but the symbolic power of the football match has made it the most enduring image of the Christmas truce. Corporal John Ferguson was among the many soldiers who wrote about their experiences that Christmas. What a sight! Little groups of Germans and British extending almost the length of our front. Out of the darkness we could hear laughter and see lighted matches, a German lighting a Scotchman's cigarette and vice versa, exchanging cigarettes and souvenirs. His description captures the widespread nature of the fraternization, extending far beyond isolated incidents to encompass significant portions of the front line. The image of enemies lighting each other's cigarettes speaks to the intimate nature of these encounters, small acts of service that demonstrated trust and friendship. These conversations were conducted in the shadow of the knowledge that tomorrow, or the next day, they would be required to resume trying to kill each other. This awareness gave the talks a poignancy that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Men who were discovering genuine friendship knew that their friendship was temporary, that the war would soon reassert its claims on their humanity. Some soldiers used these conversations to gather intelligence about enemy positions and plans, but most seemed genuinely uninterested in military matters. Instead, they talked about home, about the weather, about anything that reminded them of the world that existed beyond the trenches. One of the most solemn aspects of the Christmas truce was the opportunity it provided for both sides to bury their dead. For months, bodies had been lying in no man's land, impossible to retrieve because of the constant threat of sniper fire. The truce allowed soldiers from both sides to work together to give these fallen men proper burials, and German and British soldiers worked side by side, digging graves in the frozen earth, wrapping bodies in whatever materials they could find, and conducting simple ceremonies that honored the dead regardless of which uniform they wore. Prayers were said in German and English, and sometimes men who had never met the deceased stood with bowed heads, paying their respects to someone who had been their enemy. Chater wrote that soldiers had been wandering about at will on the top of the parapet, and that a joint burial service was held for dead British and German soldiers, retrieved from no man's land. These burial details were perhaps the most emotionally charged aspect of the truce. Soldiers who had become hardened to death by months of warfare found themselves moved to tears as they finally laid to rest comrades who had been visible but unreachable for weeks or months. The work was grim and difficult, but it was also deeply meaningful. It allowed men to reclaim some sense of dignity and humanity in the midst of a war that seemed designed to strip away both. It provided closure for deaths that had been left unresolved, and it demonstrated that even in the midst of mechanized warfare, the ancient human impulse to honor the dead remained strong. The shared burial service represented something profoundly significant about the Christmas truce. Here were men who had been trying to kill each other, now working together to ensure that the dead received proper treatment regardless of their nationality. The ceremony broke down the artificial barriers that war had created, revealing the common humanity that connected all the soldiers regardless of the uniforms they wore. The sight of British and German soldiers standing together over freshly dug graves, their heads bowed in respect for the dead, created one of the most powerful images of the entire truce. As Christmas Day wore on, the magic of the truce began to fade. Officers from both sides, who had initially been as surprised as their men by the spontaneous ceasefire, began to reassert military discipline. Some commanders had been horrified by reports of fraternization with the enemy, and orders began to filter down through the ranks that the truce must end. The return to hostilities was gradual and reluctant. Some soldiers fired warning shots into the air, giving their new friends time to return to their trenches. Others agreed on specific times when the shooting would resume, allowing everyone to prepare for the return to war. The resumption of hostilities was marked by an almost palpable sadness. Men who had shared cigarettes and shown each other photographs of their families now had to return to the business of trying to kill each other. The contrast between the humanity they had discovered during the truce and the dehumanization required by warfare was stark and painful. Many soldiers described feeling reluctant to resume firing, knowing that they might be shooting at men they had spoken with, laughed with, even shared meals with just hours before. The transition back to warfare required a psychological adjustment that many found difficult to make. Lieutenant Geoffrey Heinecke of the Queen's Westminster Rifles described the end of the truce. At 8:30 a.m., I fired 3 shots in the air and put up a flag with Merry Christmas on it, and I climbed on the parapet. The German officer, put up a sheet with thank you on it, and the German captain appeared on the parapet. We both bowed and saluted, and got down into our respective trenches, and he fired 2 shots in the air, and the war was on again. This formal conclusion to the truce, with its exchange of courtesies and mutual salutes, demonstrated the respect that had developed between the opposing forces during their brief period of peace. Of the Germans, he wrote, "They are distinctly bored with the war. In fact, one of them wanted to know what on earth we were doing here fighting them." The truce in that sector continued into Boxing Day, he commented about the Germans. "The beggars simply disregard all our warnings to get down from off their parapet, so things are at a deadlock. We can't shoot them in cold blood. I cannot see how we can get them to return to business." This quote captures the fundamental problem that the Christmas truce created for military commanders. Once soldiers had seen their enemies as human beings, it became much more difficult to ask them to kill those same people. The truce had broken down the psychological barriers that made warfare possible, creating a crisis of conscience that threatened the entire military enterprise. Chatter's letter continued with his own uncertainty about how long the truce might last. "I don't know how long it will go on for. We are, at any rate, having another truce on New Year's Day, as the Germans want to see how the photos come out." His mention of planned future truces, and the Germans' interest in seeing the photographs they had taken, suggests that the Christmas truce had created lasting connections between the opposing forces. The fact that soldiers were planning to meet again demonstrated that the truce was more than just a momentary impulse. It had created genuine relationships that transcended national boundaries. The individual stories from the Christmas truce reveal the deeply personal nature of these encounters. Private Frank Sumter of the London Rifle Brigade would carry with him for the rest of his life the memory of a young German soldier who had shown him a photograph of his sister. The German boy, for he was hardly more than a boy, had pointed to the girl in the photograph and said, in broken English, "She beautiful, yes." When Sumter nodded, the German soldier had smiled with such joy that Sumter never forgot it. These moments of human connection, so simple yet so profound, created memories that would outlast the war itself. Decades later, survivors of the Christmas truce would speak more readily about these personal encounters than about the larger military significance of their experiences. Corporal John Ferguson of the Seaforth Highlanders remembered a German soldier who had been a waiter in London before the war. The German spoke perfect English and knew the streets of London better than many of the British soldiers. They spent an hour discussing restaurants and pubs they both knew, creating a surreal conversation that bridged 2 worlds. Ferguson later wrote, "It was difficult to imagine that this cultured, well-educated man had been my enemy just hours before. We talked about London as if we were old friends meeting in a pub, not soldiers meeting on a battlefield." These conversations revealed the arbitrary nature of the conflict, how men who might have been friends in peacetime had been turned into enemies by forces beyond their control. Captain Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards wrote to his family, "I have never seen such a sight, which I shall never forget as long as I live. The Germans came out and we met in the middle, and shook hands. We shared cigarettes and chocolate. We laughed and joked together, having forgotten for the moment that we were enemies." Hulse's letter captures the almost dreamlike quality of the truce, the sense that normal reality had been temporarily suspended. His phrase, "having forgotten for the moment that we were enemies," reveals how artificial the hostility between the soldiers had become. Once they were allowed to interact as human beings, the enmity that propaganda had created simply evaporated. The truces were not unique to the Christmas period, and reflected a mood of live and let live, where infantry close together would stop fighting and fraternize, engaging in conversation. This policy of live and let live had already been developing in quiet sectors of the front, where the proximity of opposing forces and the futility of constant skirmishing had led to informal agreements to minimize unnecessary casualties. The Christmas truce represented the most dramatic expression of this sentiment, but it was part of a broader pattern of soldiers finding ways to make their impossible situations slightly more bearable. These individual connections were perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Christmas truce. Years later, when the war was over and the survivors had returned home, many would speak not of the grand gestures or the football matches, but of these small, personal moments of human connection that had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. A shared cigarette, a photograph of a loved one, a few words about home. These simple exchanges had revealed the common humanity that connected men across national boundaries. The memories of these encounters would provide comfort to veterans struggling with the psychological aftermath of the war, reminding them that even in the midst of mechanized horror, human decency had survived. The official response to the Christmas truce was uniformly negative across all military hierarchies. Military commanders on both sides were horrified by reports of the Christmas truce. General Sir Horace Smith Dorrien issued orders that such fraternization was absolutely prohibited, and similar orders were issued by German commanders. The military hierarchy understood that war required soldiers to see their enemies as less than human, and the truce had demonstrated how easily that dehumanization could be reversed. British General Sir Horace Smith Dorrien wrote in a confidential memorandum that this is only illustrative of the apathetic state we are gradually sinking into. Some accounts of the Christmas truce hold that soldiers were punished for fraternization, and top command issued orders that it should never happen again. In subsequent years, military leaders took active steps to prevent any repetition of the Christmas truce. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, making it impossible for soldiers to leave their trenches safely. Troops were rotated more frequently, preventing the development of the familiarity that had contributed to the 1914 truce. Officers were given strict orders to prevent any communication with enemy forces, with the threat of court-martial for those who allowed fraternization to occur. The military establishment had learned that allowing soldiers to see their enemies as human beings made it much more difficult to ask them to kill those same people. The official suppression of the truce extended beyond military orders. Newspapers were discouraged from reporting on the fraternization, and when they did report on it, they were encouraged to emphasize its exceptional nature and to stress that it would not be repeated. Coverage in Germany was less extensive than that of the British press, while in France, press censorship ensured that the only word that spread of the truce came from soldiers at the front or first-hand accounts told by wounded men in hospitals. The press was eventually forced to respond to the growing rumors by reprinting a government notice that fraternizing with the enemy constituted treason. The truce had revealed something about human nature that military leaders found inconvenient and dangerous. Despite official attempts to suppress its memory, the Christmas truce of 1914 became one of the most enduring and powerful stories to emerge from World War I. British newspapers went on to publish photos of the soldiers mingling, beginning a celebration of the truce revived in recent months, alongside events to mark the centenary of the war. The photographs provided irrefutable evidence that the truce had actually occurred, making it impossible for authorities to dismiss the accounts as myth or propaganda. News of the remarkable Christmas truce soon spread abroad. By the end of December, letters and photos arrived home, and newspapers began to publish accounts of the truce. John Wedderburn Maxwell described how his father sent his letter describing the truce to the Daily Telegraph. "My father was delighted to have a letter giving such a description of events, and he sent them up to the Daily Telegraph. I got into frightful rocket. It showed up that it must have been me who wrote it, and he got hold of me, gave me an awful dressing down for daring to write to the press. But of course I didn't, my old man wrote to the press." This account illustrates how the stories of the Christmas truce spread. Despite official attempts at suppression, families at home were eager to share these positive stories about their sons' experiences, even when those stories contradicted official narratives about the war. The Christmas truce represented something that people desperately wanted to believe about human nature, that even in the midst of industrialized warfare, the impulse toward peace and brotherhood could spontaneously emerge. It suggested that the young men who were fighting and dying in the trenches were not natural enemies, but rather ordinary people who had been caught up in forces beyond their control. The truce became a symbol of the common humanity that transcends national boundaries and military allegiance. It offered hope that the destructive nationalism that had led to war was not an inevitable aspect of human nature, but rather a political construction that could be overcome through personal contact and mutual understanding. In the decades following the war, the Christmas truce would be remembered in songs, poems, films, and books. It would be invoked by peace activists as evidence that war was not inevitable, that human beings possessed an innate capacity for reconciliation that could overcome even the most entrenched conflicts. But, perhaps most importantly, the truce provided comfort to the families of those who had died in the war. The knowledge that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been capable of such humanity, even in the midst of mechanized slaughter, offered a kind of redemption for the senseless waste of the conflict. The Christmas truce of 1914 was never repeated on the same scale. In subsequent years, the war became more bitter, more mechanized, more thoroughly dehumanized. The introduction of poison gas, the increasing use of artillery, and the growing casualty lists made it harder for soldiers to see their enemies as fellow human beings. While a number of similar instances occurred throughout the war, there was never another truce on the scale of Christmas 1914. The war that had begun with cavalry charges and gentlemen's agreements had evolved into something far more impersonal and deadly. By 1915, the bloody conflict of World War I erupted in all its technological fury, and the concept of another Christmas truce became unthinkable. There were several factors that made the Christmas truce of 1914 unique and unrepeatable. The men in the trenches had seen battle, but they were as yet untouched by the worst horrors that World War I would produce. The Second Battle of Ypres and its clouds of asphyxiating gas were still months away, and the mindless slaughter of Passchendaele Daily was years in the future. The soldiers involved in the Christmas truce still retained some illusions about the nature of warfare, some belief that conflicts could be conducted with honor and humanity. These illusions would be shattered by the increasingly brutal nature of the war that followed. Despite this, the Christmas truce remains a powerful and inspirational story of tenderness and compassion in the midst of the senseless chaos of war. This moment speaks to the humanity of the soldiers involved. Contemporary public reaction to the Christmas truce in 1914 was counter to the hateful propaganda demonizing enemies. The truce revealed that the ordinary soldiers fighting the war had not been infected by the hatred that their leaders sought to instill. When given the opportunity, they chose friendship over enmity, cooperation over conflict, humanity over the machinery of war. This choice, made spontaneously by thousands of men along the Western Front, represents one of the most powerful testimonies to human decency in the midst of industrial slaughter. The men who had participated in the truce carried its memory with them through the remaining years of the war. Some would die in the battles that followed, taking their memories of that impossible Christmas with them. Others would survive to return home, where they would tell their children and grandchildren about the day when the war stopped, when enemies became friends, when humanity briefly triumphed over the machinery of destruction. Alfred Dugan, Shatter himself, would be killed in action, just 3 months after writing his famous letter, dying at the Battle of Richbourg, Lavaux in March 1915. His death so soon after describing the hope and humanity of the Christmas truce seems to symbolize the tragic arc of the entire war. The Christmas truce also revealed the power of cultural connections to transcend political boundaries. The shared Christian heritage of the combatants provided a common framework for understanding the significance of Christmas, while the musical traditions that all cultures shared created an immediate means of communication. The fact that German and British soldiers could sing the same Christmas carols even in different languages demonstrated the deep cultural connections that existed beneath the surface of national antagonism. These connections had been temporarily obscured by propaganda and political rhetoric, but they emerged with powerful force when soldiers were given the opportunity to interact as human beings rather than as enemies. The photographs taken during the Christmas truce became some of the most powerful evidence for the reality of these events. This photograph captures a moment so unusual in the First World War that many people at the time, and to this day, believe it to be a myth. The images of British and German soldiers standing together, shaking hands, sharing cigarettes, and posing for cameras provided irrefutable proof that the truce had actually occurred. These photographs would become iconic images of World War I, representing the possibility of peace, even in the midst of the most destructive conflict in human history up to that point. The lull in fighting lasted until the new year in some places, but ultimately the pause was brief and the peace was short-lived. Chatter's mention of plans for a New Year's Day truce suggests that some soldiers hoped to continue the relationships they had formed during Christmas. However, increased vigilance by military authorities made such gatherings increasingly difficult and dangerous. By January 1915, the informal networks of communication that had made the Christmas truce possible had been largely dismantled by official intervention. The war machine reasserted its control over the soldiers, and the opportunity for such widespread fraternization would not arise again. In one poignant account, a German scolded his fellow soldiers during the Christmas truce. "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left?" That 25-year-old soldier's name was Adolf Hitler. This detail, reported in several accounts of the truce, adds a dark irony to the story. The future dictator who would plunge the world into an even more devastating war was present at this moment of spontaneous peace. and his reaction was to condemn it as dishonorable. Hitler's response to the Christmas truce foreshadowed his later rejection of any form of international cooperation or human decency that might interfere with his political ambitions. The French, whose country was currently occupied by German forces, were not so understanding, although there are still reports of truces between French and German troops on Christmas. The French attitude toward fraternization was complicated by the fact that German armies had overrun large portions of their country, displacing civilians and destroying communities. French soldiers found it much more difficult to see German troops as fellow human beings, when those same troops were occupying French territory and had been responsible for the deaths of French civilians. The truce was not widely adopted in French-controlled areas of the front. German soldiers had spent 1914 overrunning a huge swath of French territory, and animus toward the occupiers was too strong. There was also no equivalent truce on the Eastern Front, as Russia was still operating under the Julian calendar, and so the Russian Orthodox Christmas would not be observed until early January. This calendrical difference meant that when Western soldiers were celebrating Christmas on December 25th, Russian soldiers were still following the old calendar system that placed Christmas 13 days later. The cultural and religious differences between the Eastern and Western fronts also made such fraternization less likely, as the shared Christian traditions that had enabled communication between British and German soldiers were less universal in the ethnically and religiously diverse armies of the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the Christmas truce extended far beyond the immediate participants. For many men, the truce was, in the moment, nothing more than a welcome break from the grind and abject misery of trench life and constantly living under mortal threat. The truce was a much-desired chance to gather in the dead bodies of their friends, which had been just out of reach, in some cases for months, and must have been a pretty grim sight to live with. But the deeper significance of the truce lay in what it revealed about the soldiers' fundamental humanity. Men who had been trained to kill, who had spent months learning to see their enemies as targets rather than people, had spontaneously chosen peace over war when given the opportunity. The memory of the Christmas truce created a psychological burden for many soldiers who participated in it. Having seen their enemies as human beings, having shared food and conversation with them, having learnt about their families and their hopes, it became much more difficult to resume the business of trying to kill them. Some soldiers reported feeling sick when they had to fire on German positions after the truce ended, knowing that they might be shooting at men they had spoken with just days before. The truce had broken down the psychological barriers that made warfare possible, creating an emotional conflict that would trouble many veterans for the rest of their lives. The Christmas truce also highlighted the disconnect between the soldiers' experiences and the political rhetoric that justified the war. While politicians and generals spoke of national honor, territorial integrity, and the necessity of defeating the enemy, the soldiers who had participated in the truce knew that their supposed enemies were ordinary young men with the same fears, hopes, and dreams as themselves. This knowledge made the political justifications for the war seem hollow and meaningless. Many veterans would later describe the Christmas truce as the moment when they first began to question the purpose and morality of the conflict they were fighting. The role of music in the Christmas truce cannot be overstated. The singing that began on Christmas Eve provided the initial bridge between the opposing forces, demonstrating that cultural connections could transcend political boundaries. The fact that soldiers on both sides knew the same Christmas carols, even if they sang them in different languages, revealed the deep European cultural heritage that united them despite their political divisions. Music had the power to communicate emotions and intentions in ways that words could not, creating an immediate sense of shared humanity that made further communication possible. The exchange of gifts during the truce represented another powerful symbol of the soldiers' desire for peace and friendship. These gifts were not valuable items, but rather the small possessions that soldiers carried with them: cigarettes, chocolate, buttons, photographs, and other personal mementos. The act of giving a gift, particularly to someone who had been your enemy, required a fundamental shift in thinking about that person's humanity and worth. Receiving a gift from an enemy soldier was equally transformative, creating a sense of obligation and connection that transcended national boundaries. These exchanges created personal bonds that many veterans would remember more vividly than the battles they had fought. The Christmas truce revealed the artificial nature of national hatreds that had been constructed by political leaders and propagandists. When soldiers were allowed to interact directly with their enemies, they discovered that the stereotypes and prejudices they had been taught were largely false. German soldiers were not the brutal savages depicted in British propaganda, and British soldiers were not the mercenary oppressors described in German newspapers. Instead, they were young men who missed their families, who were cold and tired and frightened, who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and return home. This recognition of shared humanity made the political rhetoric that justified the war seem both hollow and dishonest. The temporary nature of the Christmas truce added to its poignancy and its power as a symbol. The fact that the peace was brief, that the soldiers had to return to trying to kill each other after just a few days, emphasized the tragedy of the situation they found themselves in. Men who had discovered friendship and mutual respect were forced by circumstances beyond their control to resume hostilities. This tragedy was not lost on the participants, many of whom described the end of the truce as one of the most difficult moments of their military service. The contrast between the peace they had experienced and the war they had to return to highlighted the absurdity and waste of the entire conflict. The documentation of the Christmas truce through letters, photographs, and personal accounts created a historical record that would outlast the war itself. These first-hand testimonies provided irrefutable evidence that the truce had occurred, making it impossible for authorities to dismiss the accounts as myth or exaggeration. The letters home, like Shater's famous account to his mother, preserved the immediate reactions and emotions of the participants, capturing their amazement and wonder at what they had experienced. The photographs provided visual proof that enemies had indeed become friends, even if only temporarily. These documents would become invaluable historical sources, providing future generations with detailed accounts of one of the most remarkable events in military history. The international dimension of the Christmas truce added to its significance as a symbol of human unity. The truce involved not just British and German soldiers, but also French, Belgian, and Austrian troops in various sectors of the front. This multinational character of the fraternization demonstrated that the impulse toward peace and friendship was not limited to any particular culture or nationality, but was rather a universal human response to the opportunity for reconciliation. The fact that soldiers from many different countries and backgrounds could come together in friendship, even in the midst of a devastating war, provided powerful evidence for the possibility of international cooperation and understanding. The age of the participants in the Christmas truce is particularly significant when considering its historical impact. Many of the soldiers involved were barely out of their teens, young men who had been thrust into an adult world of violence and death before they had fully formed their own values and beliefs. But for these young soldiers, the Christmas truce provided a glimpse of an alternative to the world of hatred and conflict they had been taught to accept. The experience of seeing enemies become friends, of discovering common humanity across national boundaries, would shape their understanding of war and peace for the rest of their lives. Many would become advocates for international understanding and peaceful resolution of conflicts, drawing on their memories of the Christmas truce as evidence that such cooperation was possible. The role of junior officers in facilitating or preventing the Christmas truce reveals the complex dynamics of military hierarchy during the event. Many junior officers, particularly lieutenants and captains who lived closely with their men, were sympathetic to the desire for a temporary respite from the horrors of war. Some actively encouraged the fraternization, participating themselves in the exchanges with enemy soldiers. Others, bound by military discipline and concerns about their careers, attempted to prevent or limit the interactions. Senior officers, who were typically located further from the front lines, were almost universally opposed to the truce and worked to ensure it would not happen again. This pattern reveals how proximity to the actual fighting affected attitudes toward the enemy and toward the possibility of peace. The Christmas truce also highlighted the role of religion in providing a framework for peace and reconciliation. The shared Christian heritage of most participants provided a common vocabulary and set of symbols that made communication possible. The celebration of Christmas, with its emphasis on peace on earth and goodwill toward men, created a religious imperative for laying down arms and treating enemies as brothers. Many soldiers described feeling that participating in the truce was a religious duty, a way of honoring the true meaning of Christmas in the midst of a conflict that seemed to contradict everything their faith taught them about human relations. The fact that the truce occurred during the most sacred season of the Christian calendar gave it a spiritual dimension that secular ceasefires could never achieve. The linguistic challenges faced during the Christmas truce reveal both the barriers and the possibilities for international communication. While few soldiers were fluent in their enemies' languages, They found creative ways to communicate through gestures, shared activities, and the universal languages of music and friendship. The fact that some German soldiers had worked in Britain before the war created unexpected opportunities for more sophisticated communication, allowing for deeper conversations about shared experiences and mutual acquaintances. These linguistic connections often became the foundation for longer and more meaningful exchanges, demonstrating how personal relationships could transcend national boundaries when language barriers were overcome. The economic aspects of the Christmas truce, while less dramatic than the emotional and spiritual dimensions, also played an important role in the event. The exchange of goods between soldiers revealed the different material conditions faced by the various armies. German soldiers often had better bread and sausages, while British soldiers had superior chocolate and cigarettes. These exchanges allowed soldiers to improve their material conditions while also creating bonds of reciprocity and mutual obligation. The fact that men who had nothing were willing to share what little they had with their enemies demonstrated the power of human generosity even in the most desperate circumstances. The medical aspects of the Christmas truce provided another dimension to the humanitarian impulse that drove the event. Soldiers from both sides worked together to care for wounded men who had been lying in no man's land, providing medical assistance regardless of nationality. This cooperation in caring for the wounded represented one of the most powerful examples of the triumph of humanity over military necessity. The fact that enemy soldiers would risk their own safety to help wounded opponents demonstrated that the basic human impulse to relieve suffering could overcome even the most intense military indoctrination. These acts of medical mercy created some of the most lasting memories of the truce for the participants. The aftermath of the Christmas truce in terms of military discipline and morale created lasting concerns for military commanders. While most participants returned to their duties without incident, some soldiers found it increasingly difficult to engage in aggressive action against enemies they had come to see as human beings. The military authorities noted increased instances of soldiers deliberately missing their targets, refusing to participate in raids, or showing reluctance to advance against enemy positions. This erosion of fighting spirit, from the military perspective, justified the harsh measures taken to prevent future fraternization. The commander's fears that the truce would undermine military effectiveness proved to be largely accurate, as many soldiers never regained their early enthusiasm for aggressive action against the enemy. The cultural memory of the Christmas truce has evolved significantly since 1914, taking on new meanings and significance for each generation. During the interwar period, the truce was remembered primarily as a symbol of the futility of war and the possibility of international understanding. During World War II, when the same nations found themselves again at war, the memory of the Christmas truce served as a reminder of the humanity that could be found even among enemies. In the Cold War era, the truce became a symbol of the possibility for peaceful coexistence between ideological opponents. Today, in an era of global terrorism and ethnic conflict, the Christmas truce serves as a reminder that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground when they are willing to see each other as human beings. The artistic and literary legacy of the Christmas truce has ensured its place in popular culture and historical memory. Poems, songs, films, and television programs have celebrated the event, each adding new layers of meaning and interpretation to the basic historical facts. While some of these artistic interpretations have taken liberties with the historical record, they have also ensured that the story of the Christmas truce continues to reach new audiences and inspire new generations. The power of the story to move and inspire people more than a century after the event demonstrates its enduring relevance as a symbol of hope and human decency in the face of conflict and hatred. The Christmas truce of 1914 stands as one of the most remarkable examples of spontaneous peacemaking in human history. The fact that thousands of soldiers without authorization from their commanders and despite months of military indoctrination chose to lay down their weapons and embrace their enemies demonstrates the persistent power of human decency, even in the most extreme circumstances. The truce revealed that the ordinary soldiers who fought the wars of the early 20th century retained their fundamental humanity despite the dehumanizing effects of modern warfare. Their choice to seek friendship rather than victory, understanding rather than dominance, peace rather than glory, provides a powerful example for all subsequent generations. As we prepare to move forward in our journey through the Great War, let us carry with us the memory of that Christmas morning when young men from different countries played football in no man's land. when soldiers who had been trying to kill each other shared photographs of their families, when the simple act of singing Christmas carols became a bridge across the wasteland of war. The Christmas truce reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, the light of our shared humanity can still shine through. It was a brief moment of peace in 4 years of mechanized horror, but it was real, and it happened, and it continues to offer hope that the impulse toward peace and brotherhood that emerged so spontaneously in those trenches on Christmas morning 1914 remains alive in the human heart. Chapter 3: Gas masks and propaganda, the terrifying evolution of modern warfare. As we transition from that miraculous moment of human connection during the Christmas truce, we must now confront how the Great War became the birthplace of an entirely new kind of terror. The conflict that had briefly paused for carols and football matches would soon introduce weapons designed not just to kill, but to inspire a primal, choking fear that would haunt survivors for decades. The war that began with cavalry charges and gentlemen's agreements was about to evolve into something far more sinister, mechanized and impersonal than anyone could have imagined. It was April 22nd, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, when the nature of warfare changed forever. French and Canadian troops holding a section of the Allied line noticed something peculiar in the German trenches across no man's land. There seemed to be unusual activity, men moving with purpose, carrying strange cylindrical objects that they positioned carefully along their front lines. On April 14, reliable and detailed information was received at British and French headquarters that the Germans intended to use a new weapon, asphyxiating gas discharged from cylinders, opposite the northern edge of the Ypres salient at Langemarck. Yet despite these warnings, the full implications of what was about to unfold remained incomprehensible to those who would soon experience it. In the late afternoon of April 22, 1915, members of a special unit of the German army opened the valves on more than 6,000 steel cylinders arrayed in trenches along their defensive perimeter at Ypres, Belgium. Within 10 minutes, 60 tons of chlorine gas drifted over the opposing French trenches, engulfing all those downwind. As the afternoon wore on, a gentle breeze began to blow from the German positions toward the Allied trenches. At first this seemed like nothing more than the usual wind that swept across the battlefield. But then, something extraordinary and terrifying began to unfold. A wall of yellow-green vapor began to rise from the German trenches, dense and unnatural, moving with the wind like a slow, deliberate tide. The gas had a distinctive odor, resembling pineapple and pepper. This seemingly innocent description masks the deadly reality of what was about to become the first effective use of poison gas on the Western Front. The soldiers watching this phenomenon had no frame of reference for what they were seeing. Some thought it might be smoke, designed to screen a German attack. Others wondered if it might be some kind of new explosive device. The French officers, assuming at first that the German infantry were advancing behind a smoke screen, alerted the troops. None of them understood that they were witnessing the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in modern warfare, the release of chlorine gas that would kill over 1,000 men and wound thousands more in a matter of minutes. Disregarding intelligence reports about the strange cylinders prior to the attack, the French troops were totally unprepared for this new and horrifying weapon. Imagine yourself as one of those soldiers, watching this strange yellow-green cloud approaching your position. At first it moves slowly, almost lazily, drifting across no man's land like morning fog. Archibald James, an observer in the Royal Flying Corps, saw it being used for the first time. I witnessed from the air the first gas attack when the Germans used chlorine gas in the Ypres salient. Suddenly we saw to the north of us in the salient this yellow wall moving quite slowly towards our lines. We hadn't any idea what it was. We reported it, of course, when we landed, and an hour or so later the smell of chlorine actually reached our aerodrome. The fact that the smell reached an aerodrome hours later gives some indication of the massive scale of this first gas deployment. But as the cloud draws closer, you begin to smell something sharp and chemical, something that makes your nose burn and your eyes water. The cloud reaches your trench, and suddenly the air itself becomes your enemy. When the gas reached the front Allied trenches, soldiers began to complain of chest pains and a burning sensation in the throat. Your first breath of the chlorine gas burns your lungs like fire. Your throat constricts, your eyes stream with tears, and you find yourself gasping for air that seems to have turned to acid. Around you, your fellow soldiers are experiencing the same horrifying transformation of the very air they need to survive into something that attacks them from within. Those who survived the first chlorine attack described the sensation as drowning while standing on dry land. The gas attacked the respiratory system, causing the lungs to fill with fluid, as the body desperately tried to protect itself from the chemical assault. Chlorine is a powerful irritant that can inflict damage to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. At high concentrations and prolonged exposure, it can cause death by asphyxiation. Men who had faced bullets and shells with courage found themselves fleeing in panic from an enemy they could not fight, could not see clearly, and could not escape by running faster or ducking lower. Soldiers realized they were being gassed, and many ran as fast as they could. The surprise use of chlorine gas allowed the Germans to rupture the French line along a 6-kilometer, 3.7-mile front, causing terror and forcing a panicked and chaotic retreat. An hour after the attack began, there was a 1,500-yard, 1.4 kilometers gap in the Allied line. The attack forced 2 colonial French divisions north of Ypres from their positions, creating a 5-mile gap in the Allied line defending the city. The psychological impact of gas warfare was as devastating as its physical effects. Soldiers, who had learned to cope with the visible dangers of bullets and explosions, now had to fear the very air around them. Every change in wind direction became a source of anxiety. Every unusual smell might herald the approach of death in a form more terrifying than any conventional weapon. The irony of this first gas attack was that the Germans themselves were not fully prepared to exploit their success. Fearing the chlorine, few German soldiers moved forward, and the delay enabled Canadian and British troops to retake the position before the Germans could exploit the gap. The German troops, even though they had initiated the attack, were afraid to advance through the area they had just poisoned, uncertain about the lingering effects of their own weapon. This hesitation would prove to be a missed opportunity, as subsequent gas attacks would face better prepared defenders who had learned to cope with this new form of warfare. The success of that first chlorine attack led to a horrifying arms race in chemical warfare. Military scientists on both sides began developing new and more effective ways to weaponize the atmosphere itself. Chemical warfare had begun in a tentative way before Ypres, with the French use of tear gas grenades in 1914 and early 1950. The first instance of large-scale use of gas as a weapon was on 31 January 1915, when Germany fired 18,000 artillery shells containing liquid cetylyl bromide tear gas on Russian positions on the Rorka River, west of Warsaw during the Battle of Belimov. Instead of vaporizing, the chemical froze and failed to have the desired effect. Chlorine was just the beginning, a crude but effective introduction to a new realm of warfare that would produce increasingly sophisticated methods of causing suffering. German chemical companies BASF, Hoechst and Bayer, which formed the IG Farben conglomerate in 1925, had been making chlorine as a byproduct of their dye manufacturing. In cooperation with Fritz Haber of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry in Berlin, they began developing methods of discharging chlorine gas against enemy trenches. By 1915, scientists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute had developed an effective chlorine gas weapon. By placing chlorine into specially designed cylinders, chlorine gas could be discharged in a dense cloud that eventually settled into enemy trenches. The involvement of these major chemical companies demonstrates how quickly industrial capacity was redirected toward military purposes, transforming peacetime production into instruments of war. Phosgene gas followed, a chemical that was harder to detect than chlorine because it had a sweet smell, like newly mown hay. Soldiers might breathe it in without immediately realizing they had been poisoned, only to develop fatal lung damage hours later. This delayed action made phosgene particularly cruel. Men might think they had escaped unharmed, only to die slowly as their lungs filled with fluid in the hours that followed. In the first combined chlorine-phosgene attack by Germany against British troops at Wiltje near Diepen, Belgium on 19 December 1915, 88 tons of the gas were released from cylinders, causing 169 casualties and 69 deaths. Around 36,600 tons of phosgene were manufactured during the war, out of a total of 190,000 tons for all chemical weapons, making it second only to chlorine, 93,800 tons in the quantity manufactured. But perhaps the most notorious of all chemical weapons was mustard gas. Introduced in 1917, this substance was insidious in ways that went beyond its immediate effects. Mustard gas caused horrific blistering of the skin and respiratory system, but it also lingered on the battlefield for days or even weeks, contaminating everything it touched. The soldiers could be poisoned by handling equipment that had been exposed to mustard gas, or by walking through areas where it had been deployed days earlier. The gas clung to clothing, to equipment, to the earth itself. They created zones of persistent danger that transformed familiar landscapes into poisoned wastelands. Areas that had been safe passages became death traps that could kill the unwary long after the initial attack had ended. The introduction of chemical weapons necessitated the development of protective equipment that became one of the most recognizable symbols of World War I, the gas mask. These devices transformed the human face into something alien and insect-like, creating an image that captured the dehumanizing nature of modern warfare. Early gas masks were crude affairs, little more than cloth soaked in chemicals, held over the nose and mouth in a desperate attempt to filter out poison. There was no technology to protect the soldiers from this new weapon. An operational gas mask was not available, so the Allied soldiers improvised with linen masks soaked in water and respirators made from lint and tape. After the first German chlorine gas attacks, Allied troops were supplied with masks of cotton pads soaked in urine. It had been discovered that the urea in the pad neutralized the chlorine. The pads were held over the face until the gas dispersed. Other soldiers preferred to use a handkerchief, sock or flannel body belt, dampened with a sodium bicarbonate solution, and tied across the mouth and nose until the gas passed. And Britain, the Daily Mail newspaper, encouraged women to manufacture cotton pads, and within 1 month, a variety of pad respirators were available to British and French troops, along with motoring goggles to protect the eyes. The response was enormous, and 1 million gas masks were produced in a day. Unfortunately, the male's design was useless when dry and caused suffocation when wet. The respirator was responsible for the deaths of scores of men. As the chemical weapons became more sophisticated, so too did the protective equipment. But by 6 July 1915, the entire British Army was equipped with the more effective smoke helmet designed by Major Cluny Macpherson, Newfoundland Regiment, which was a flannel bag with a celluloid window, which entirely covered the head. The British P-gas helmet, issued at the time, was impregnated with sodium phenolate, and partially effective against phosgene. The modified pH gas helmet, which was impregnated with phenate hexamine and hexamethylene tetramine, urotropine, to improve the protection against phosgene, was issued in January. By the end of the war, soldiers carried complex breathing apparatus that included filters, valves, and rubberized facepieces that sealed completely around the head. Wearing a gas mask was an exercise in claustrophobia and sensory deprivation. The rubber facepiece pressed tightly against the skin, creating an airtight seal that made every breath a conscious effort. Vision was limited to what could be seen through small, often fogged eyepieces. Hearing was muffled, making communication difficult and adding to the sense of isolation that the mask created. Soldiers found it difficult to fight like this, and attempts were made to develop a better means of protection against gas attacks. The gas mask became a constant companion for soldiers on the Western Front. They carried them everywhere, ready to don them at the first sign of a gas attack. The time it took to put on a mask could mean the difference between life and death, so soldiers practiced the procedure until it became as automatic as breathing itself. But perhaps most unsettling was what the gas mask represented: the transformation of the human face into something mechanical and inhuman. Photographs of soldiers wearing gas masks show figures that look more like creatures from a nightmare than human beings. The mask erased individual identity, turning each soldier into an anonymous figure in a landscape of industrial horror. The visual impact of the gas mask became one of the most enduring images of World War I, symbolizing how modern warfare had stripped away humanity and replaced it with mechanical necessity. Chemical weapons introduced a new kind of fear to warfare: the fear of the invisible. Unlike bullets or shells, which soldiers could see coming and attempt to avoid, gas attacks were often silent and initially imperceptible. A change in wind direction could bring death drifting across no man's land without warning. This invisible threat changed the rhythm of life in the trenches. Soldiers became hyper-vigilant about every smell, every change in the atmosphere around them. Unusual odor might trigger a panic as men scrambled to put on their gas masks, only to discover that the smell was nothing more than a cooking fire or a latrine. The constant vigilance required to guard against gas attacks was mentally exhausting. Soldiers had to remain alert, not just to the visible dangers of warfare, but to subtle changes in their environment that might indicate the presence of poison in the air they breathed. Sleep became more difficult as the subconscious mind remained partially alert for the signs of a gas attack. Gas attacks often came at dawn or dusk, when atmospheric conditions were most favorable for the effective deployment of chemical weapons. These times of day, which had once been peaceful transitions between day and night, became periods of heightened anxiety. The beauty of a sunrise could be marred by the fear that it might bring with it a wall of poison gas. Poison gas was initially released from cylinders, but this required ideal weather conditions and could be very risky. In the first British gas attack, at Luce in September 1915, much of the gas was blown back into the faces of the British troops. From 1916, gas was employed in shells instead, which allowed attacks from a much greater range. The development of gas shells eliminated the weather dependency that had made cylinder attacks so unpredictable, allowing commanders to use chemical weapons as part of coordinated artillery bombardments rather than hoping for favorable winds. The race was then on between the introduction of new and more effective poison gases and the production of effective countermeasures, which marked gas warfare until the armistice in November. Gases used included chlorine, mustard gas, bromine, and phosgene, and the German army was the most prolific user of gas warfare. In 1915, when poison gas was relatively new, less than 3% of British gas casualties died. In 1916, the proportion of fatalities jumped to 7%. By 1918, the figure was back below 3%, though the total number of British gas casualties was now 9 times the 1915 levels. The statistical progression tells the story of chemical warfare. As weapons became more deadly, countermeasures improved, but the sheer scale of gas usage continued to grow throughout the war. While chemical weapons attacked the body, propaganda attacked the mind, and World War I saw the development of both into sophisticated tools of warfare. Governments on all sides recognized that maintaining public support for an increasingly costly and horrific war required careful management of information and public opinion. During World War I, the impact of the poster as a means of communication was greater than at any other time during history. But the ability of posters to inspire, inform, and persuade, combined with vibrant design trends in many of the participating countries to produce thousands of interesting visual works. The propaganda efforts of World War I were unprecedented in their scope and sophistication. Governments established entire departments dedicated to influencing public opinion, employing artists, writers, and psychologists to create messages that would maintain support for the war effort while demonizing the enemy. Propaganda was very much in its formative stages of development. It was the concept of governments appealing to a mass audience. It was a completely new phenomenon. Certainly at the beginning of the war it was a bit amateurish, a bit piecemeal. Posters became one of the most visible forms of propaganda, appearing on street corners, in shop windows, and on public buildings throughout the warring nations. These images used powerful visual symbolism to convey simple, emotional messages. The enemy was depicted as monstrous, barbaric, and threatening to everything decent and civilized. The home country's cause was portrayed as righteous, noble, and essential for the protection of freedom and democracy. British propaganda portrayed German soldiers as Huns, savage barbarians who committed atrocities against innocent civilians. Posters produced by the Allies often depict Germany as a caricature, called a Hun, who was usually portrayed wearing a pickelhaube, a spiked helmet, often covered in blood. German propaganda depicted British forces as mercenaries fighting for an empire built on exploitation and greed. French propaganda emphasized the defense of civilization itself against Germanic brutality. Each side created a narrative that made their cause seem not just justified, but essential for the survival of everything good and decent in the world. This poster shows a German soldier wearing a pirate-like skull and crossbones, and brandishing a bloody sword as he wades through a tide of women's and children's bodies. Designs such as this dehumanized the Germans, and characterized them as animalistic and therefore without human morals. The careful construction of truth became a central feature of wartime propaganda. The propaganda of World War I was notable, not just for what it said, but for what it didn't say. The governments carefully controlled the flow of information about the war, censoring reports that might undermine public support, and emphasizing stories that reinforced the desired narrative. Newspapers were subject to strict censorship, with military censors reviewing articles before publication to ensure they didn't reveal sensitive information or present the war in an unfavorable light. Casualty figures were often understated or delayed in publication. Reports of military failures were suppressed or spun to minimize their impact on public morale. Meanwhile, stories of heroism, sacrifice, and progress were amplified and widely distributed. Every small victory was celebrated, Every act of bravery was publicized, and every sign of enemy weakness was emphasized. The result was a carefully constructed version of reality that bore little resemblance to the actual experience of soldiers at the front. This manipulation of information created a profound disconnect between the home front and the battlefield. Families reading newspapers at home were told that their sons and husbands were engaged in a glorious crusade for freedom and democracy. The soldiers themselves were experiencing a mechanized horror that bore no resemblance to the sanitized version of war being presented to the public. The industrial production of hatred became a systematic endeavor during World War I. Propaganda during World War I was not limited to government publications. The entire cultural apparatus of each nation was mobilized to support the war effort. Writers, artists, musicians, and filmmakers all contributed to the creation of a culture that glorified warfare and demonized the enemy. Children's books portrayed the enemy as monsters and the home country's soldiers as heroes. Popular songs celebrated military victories and mourned fallen soldiers in ways that reinforced the righteousness of the cause. Films depicted dramatic scenes of battlefield heroism, while carefully avoiding the grim realities of trench warfare. This cultural mobilization was so complete that it became difficult for individuals to maintain perspective on the war. Every aspect of daily life was infused with propaganda messages that reinforced the idea that the war was not just necessary, but noble. But to question the war effort was to question not just government policy, but the entire cultural framework within which people lived their lives. The propaganda was particularly effective because it built upon existing national prejudices and cultural stereotypes. British propaganda about German frightfulness resonated with existing suspicions about Germanic militarism. German propaganda about British imperialism drew upon real grievances about economic competition and colonial rivalry. World War I marked the first time that modern communication technologies were systematically employed for propaganda purposes. The printing press allowed for the mass production of posters, pamphlets, and newspapers. The photography was used to document both real and staged scenes that supported the propaganda narrative. Motion pictures, still a relatively new technology, were quickly recognized as a powerful tool for influencing public opinion. Governments produced films that depicted their soldiers as heroic and their enemies as villainous. These films were shown in theaters throughout the home countries, reaching audiences that included people who couldn't read or who might not otherwise encounter propaganda materials. The telephone and telegraph allowed for the rapid coordination of propaganda efforts across vast distances. A story that supported the war effort could be quickly distributed to newspapers and other media outlets throughout a country, ensuring that the same message reached the entire population simultaneously. Its technological sophistication gave World War I propaganda a reach and impact that was unprecedented in human history. For the first time, entire populations could be systematically exposed to the same messages, creating a uniformity of public opinion that would have been impossible in earlier conflicts. Both chemical weapons and propaganda exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology, using fear as a tool to achieve their objectives. Gas attacks created a primal terror of suffocation and poisoning, fears that struck at the most basic human need for clean air to breathe. The randomness and invisibility of gas attacks made them particularly effective at undermining morale and creating psychological casualties. Propaganda, meanwhile, exploited fears about national survival, cultural destruction, and personal safety. It created images of enemies who threatened not just military defeat, but the complete destruction of everything familiar and valuable. These fears were often greatly exaggerated, but they were rooted in real anxieties that made them psychologically powerful. The combination of these two tools, physical weapons that attacked the body and information weapons that attacked the mind, created a new kind of warfare that extended far beyond the battlefield. Entire populations became combatants in a conflict that sought to destroy not just enemy armies but enemy societies. In many ways, the world still lives in the shadow of April 9. The precedent set by chemical weapons and systematic propaganda created templates for warfare that would be used and refined in subsequent conflicts. The techniques of mass persuasion developed during World War I would be employed by totalitarian regimes in the following decades, contributing to some of the darkest chapters in human history. The British expressed outrage at Germany's use of poison gas at Ypres, and responded by developing their own gas warfare capability. The immediate public outcry for retaliation resulted in quick adoption of defensive anti-gas measures. including new companies of Royal Engineers responsible for offensive gas warfare. Both sides developed gas weapons and countermeasures, which changed the nature of gas warfare. The French and British used gas at the Battle of Loos in late September. By the end of the war, all major combatants had developed extensive chemical weapons programs, producing thousands of tons of various poisonous gases and creating elaborate systems for their delivery and defense against them. The German firing of more than 150 tons of lethal chlorine gas against two French colonial divisions at Ypres in Belgium on April 22, 1915, had shocked and horrified their Allied opponents in World War I, and provoked angry outbursts against what was seen as inexcusable barbarism, even in the context of warfare. As Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force (BEF), wrote heatedly of the German attacks at Ypres, "All the scientific resources of Germany have apparently been brought into play to produce a gas of so virulent and poisonous a nature that any human being brought into contact with it is first paralyzed and then meets with a lingering and agonizing death." The German statement of June 25, 1915, was a response to this outraged reaction by the Allies. They considered it hypocritical, claiming that their opponents, namely the French, had been manufacturing and employing gas in battle well before the Second Battle of Ypres, though the French were, in fact, the first to employ gas during World War I. In August 1914, they used tear gas grenades containing xylyl bromide to confront the initial German advance in Belgium and northeastern France. Germany was undoubtedly the first belligerent nation during the war to put serious thought and work into the development of chemical weapons that were not merely irritants, like xylyl bromide, but could be used in large quantities to inflict a major defeat on the enemy. The lasting scars left by chemical weapons and propaganda extended far beyond the end of World War I. The chemical weapons and propaganda techniques developed during World War I left lasting scars on both individuals and societies. Veterans who had survived gas attacks often suffered from respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. Many also experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered not just by their physical experiences, but by the psychological impact of warfare that attacked the very air they breathed. Although chemical weapons killed proportionally few soldiers in World War I, 1914-1918, the psychological damage from gas fright and the exposure of large numbers of soldiers, munitions workers, and civilians to novel chemical agents created a legacy of fear and suspicion that persists to this day. The propaganda of World War I also had lasting effects, creating patterns of thinking about enemies and warfare that would influence international relations for decades. The techniques of mass persuasion developed during the war would be refined and employed by totalitarian regimes in the following decades, contributing to some of the darkest chapters in human history. Perhaps most significantly, World War I established the precedent that warfare could legitimately target not just enemy armies but enemy populations. The use of chemical weapons against soldiers and propaganda against civilians blurred the traditional distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, creating a new understanding of warfare as a total conflict that involved entire societies. Though the psychological impact of poison gas was undoubtedly great, its actual impact on the war, like that of the tank, is debatable, due to the low rate of fatality associated with the gas attacks. Gas did not prove as decisive a weapon as was anticipated, but it was effective in clearing enemy forward positions. Despite the relatively low fatality rates, chemical weapons had a profound impact on the conduct of warfare. They forced all armies to invest heavily in protective equipment and training, diverting resources from other military needs. They created new categories of casualties that strained medical systems unprepared for chemical injuries. Most importantly, they introduced an element of terror and unpredictability that fundamentally changed the soldier's experience of warfare. The archaeological evidence of chemical warfare continues to surface more than a century after the war ended. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of the chemical warfare that scarred the Western Front. Shells containing chemical agents are still occasionally discovered in the fields of Belgium and France, their contents still lethal after more than a century. These discoveries serve as stark reminders of the persistence of the weapons that were first deployed during the Great War. The soil of former battlefields still shows traces of the chemical contamination that occurred during the war. In some areas, the ground remains poisoned, unable to support normal plant growth even after more than 100 years. These dead zones serve as permanent monuments to the introduction of chemical warfare and its lasting impact on the environment. Museums throughout Europe house collections of gas masks, propaganda posters, and other artifacts from World War I. These objects, preserved in glass cases, offer contemporary visitors a glimpse into a world where the air itself could become poisonous and where every piece of printed material carried messages designed to shape public opinion about matters of life and death. The gas masks, with their grotesque insect-like appearance, serve as particularly powerful reminders of how modern warfare transformed soldiers into something barely recognizable as human. The propaganda posters, with their vivid colors and emotional appeals, demonstrate the systematic effort to manipulate public opinion on an unprecedented scale. The evolution of chemical weapons during World War I followed a pattern that would become familiar in subsequent conflicts, as each side attempted to develop countermeasures to enemy innovations, while simultaneously working to create new and more effective weapons. The cycle of innovation and counter-innovation created an arms race that consumed enormous resources and scientific talent. Some of the most brilliant chemists and engineers of the early 20th century devoted their careers to developing new ways to poison and kill, while others worked equally hard to develop protective measures and treatments for chemical casualties. The ethical questions raised by chemical warfare were largely ignored during the war itself, as military necessity took precedence over moral considerations. Scientists who had devoted their peacetime careers to improving human life through chemistry found themselves creating instruments of death and suffering. The transformation of industrial chemicals into weapons of war demonstrated how quickly scientific knowledge could be perverted for destructive purposes. The same expertise that could be used to develop new medicines or improve agricultural productivity was redirected toward creating increasingly sophisticated methods of causing pain and death. Fritz Haber, often called the father of chemical warfare, exemplified this moral complexity. A brilliant chemist who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on synthesizing ammonia, a process that revolutionized agriculture and helped feed millions of people. Haber also became the leading advocate for chemical weapons in Germany, as his wife, also a chemist, committed suicide in protest against his involvement in gas warfare. But Haber continued his work, convinced that chemical weapons would shorten the war, and ultimately save lives by bringing it to a quicker conclusion. This tragic irony, that the same scientific knowledge could be used to sustain life or destroy it, became one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered during World War I proved even more durable and influential than chemical weapons. While the major powers eventually agreed to limit the use of chemical weapons through international treaties, propaganda and psychological manipulation became permanent features of modern conflict. The lessons learned about mass communication, the power of visual imagery, and the techniques for manipulating public opinion would be applied in countless subsequent conflicts and political campaigns. The infrastructure created for wartime propaganda, including government information agencies and media coordination systems, would become permanent features of modern governments. The visual culture created by World War I propaganda had a lasting impact on art, advertising, and political communication. The bold, simplified imagery used in recruitment posters influenced commercial advertising for decades. The techniques for using color, composition, and symbolism to convey emotional messages became standard tools in graphic design. The understanding of how images could be used to shape public opinion influenced everything from political campaigns to commercial marketing. In many ways, the visual culture of the modern world was shaped by the propaganda innovations of World War I. The international dimension of propaganda warfare during World War I established patterns that would persist throughout the 20th century. Each nation's propaganda was designed not just to influence its own population, but to shape international opinion and gain support from neutral countries. The battle for American public opinion, waged through newspapers, films, and public speaking campaigns, demonstrated how modern wars would extend beyond the battlefield to encompass global public relations campaigns. The techniques developed for international propaganda would be refined and expanded during World War II and the Cold War, creating a permanent apparatus for international information warfare. As we settle into sleep tonight, safe from the invisible terrors that haunted the trenches of the Western Front, we can reflect on how quickly human ingenuity can be turned toward destructive purposes. The same scientific knowledge that could cure disease was used to create new forms of suffering. The same communication technologies that could educate and inform were employed to deceive and manipulate. Yet in understanding these dark innovations, we also gain insight into the resilience of the human spirit. Soldiers who faced chemical attacks continued to fight, not just against their enemies, but against the fear that these weapons were designed to inspire. Civilians who were bombarded with propaganda maintained a capacity for independent thought and moral judgment, even when every message they encountered told them to hate and fear. The legacy of chemical weapons and propaganda from World War I serves as a permanent reminder of the choices that societies face when confronted with conflict. The decision to develop and use weapons that cause indiscriminate suffering, the choice to manipulate public opinion through systematic deception, these represent fundamental moral choices that each generation must make anew. The technologies may change, but the ethical questions remain constant. How far are we willing to go to achieve military victory? What limits should exist on the methods used to influence public opinion? How do we balance the need for security with the obligation to preserve our humanity? The men who experienced the first gas attacks at Ypres in 1915 could not have imagined that they were witnessing the birth of a form of warfare that would threaten humanity for generations to come. The women who worked in munitions factories producing poison gas could not have foreseen that the chemicals they were making would become templates for weapons of mass destruction. The artists and writers who created wartime propaganda could not have anticipated that their techniques would be used to justify genocide and promote totalitarian regimes. Yet their experiences and their choices continue to shape our world more than a century later. In our final segment, we will explore the stark contrasts that defined the Great War, the difference between those who made the decisions and those who paid the price, between the comfort of headquarters and the horror of the front lines, between the rhetoric of glory and the reality of mechanized slaughter. These contrasts, perhaps more than any other aspect of the war, reveal the moral complexities and human costs of modern conflict. They remind us that behind every military decision are human beings, some who suffer the consequences, and others who remain safely removed from the destruction they have ordered. Understanding these contrasts is essential for comprehending not just the Great War, but the nature of power and responsibility in any conflict. Chapter 4: Generals and Gentlemen, Life Behind the Lines. As we have journeyed through the mud and terror of the trenches, witnessed the miracle of the Christmas truce, and explored the dark innovations of gas and propaganda, we must now turn our attention to a different world, one that existed simultaneously with the horror we have described, yet seemed to belong to an entirely different universe. 20 miles behind the front lines, in the rolling countryside of northern France, stood magnificent chateaux that had been requisitioned by British High Command as headquarters. These buildings, dating from centuries past, their elegant facades unmarked by shell damage, their manicured gardens still tended by local groundskeepers, who had remained despite the war raging just beyond the horizon, housed a reality so removed from trench life that it seemed almost fictional. Here, in rooms panelled with dark wood and hung with oil portraits of long-dead French nobility, the generals who commanded the armies in the trenches lived lives that bore no resemblance to the existence of the men they sent into battle. The contrast was so stark, so complete, that it seemed almost impossible that both realities could exist within the same war, under the same grey sky. It was at Montreal-sur-Mer that Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army on the Western Front, installed his general headquarters, Haig, between March 1916 and April 1919. Montreal-sur-Mer is a commune with a normal population of about 2,000 located in Pas-de-Calais, 24 miles south of Boulogne-sur-Mer, 35 miles north of Paris, and 8 miles from the sea. Montreal was one of the most pleasant and respectable places one could imagine in France. Before the war, from the 7th century, there had been strong religious associations for Montreal, first a monastery, later a shrine, and reports of miracles. Imagine yourself approaching this chateau on a crisp morning in 1917. The gravel crunches beneath the wheels of a staff car as it winds up the tree-lined drive. The sound of artillery is audible in the distance, a constant rumble like summer thunder, but here it seems abstract, almost atmospheric. Background music to a drama being played out somewhere else, by someone else. General Haig himself worked at the Château de Beaurepaire, 2 miles south of Montreuil. The building provided not just offices but living quarters that would have been envied by the wealthiest civilians back home. There was sufficient billeting accommodation in the town's houses, and the neighbouring chateau. By 1918, an estimated 1,700 soldiers were working within the town walls. Between 3,000 and 3,500 more were working in or close to the town, bringing the total to 5,000. For 3 years, GHQ dominated the life of the town of Montreuil. The generals who inhabited these headquarters lived according to a code that predated the mechanized horror they were orchestrating. They rose at a civilized hour, typically around 8 a.m., and began their day with a proper English breakfast served on fine china that had been carefully transported from England or requisitioned from the chateau's original owners. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of British forces, maintained a routine that would have been familiar to any gentleman of the Edwardian era. He took his breakfast while reviewing overnight dispatches from the front, reports that reduced the previous night's casualties to neat columns of numbers on official forms. The death of 1,000 men might be summarized in a single paragraph, their suffering distilled into statistics that could be consumed along with eggs and bacon. After breakfast, Haig would typically spend the morning in conference with his staff officers, studying maps that showed the front lines as clean, precise markings on paper. These maps bore no resemblance to the reality of the trenches. They showed none of the mud, none of the bodies that lay unburied in no man's land, none of the terror that gripped men who lived underground like moles. The afternoon might bring a tour of inspection, but these tours rarely ventured closer than 5 or 10 miles from the actual fighting. Haig and his fellow commanders would motor through the countryside in comfortable staff cars, stopping to review supply depots, training camps and administrative headquarters. They might speak with junior officers who had recently returned from the front, but these conversations were conducted in the formal language of military reports rather than the raw truth of lived experience. Even in the midst of organizing one of history's most devastating conflicts, the social conventions of the British upper class continued unabated. Dinner parties were held regularly at headquarters, with local French dignitaries, visiting politicians and war correspondents invited to join the generals for elaborate meals that featured multiple courses and fine wines. King George V and other dignitaries would periodically drop in and visit Haig at the chateau. These dinners were formal affairs, conducted according to the strict protocols of Edwardian society, guests dressed in evening wear. Conversations were carefully modulated to avoid unpleasant topics, and the war itself was discussed in abstract terms that emphasized strategy and grand movements rather than the human cost of the decisions being made. The irony was profound and troubling. While soldiers in the trenches shared tins of bully beef with rats and fought over scraps of mouldy bread, their commanders dined on roast beef, fresh vegetables, and delicate pastries prepared by chefs who had been specially recruited for the headquarters staff. The contrast in nutrition alone was staggering. Generals maintained their health and vigor while their troops suffered from malnutrition, disease, and the gradual physical deterioration that came from months of exposure to the elements. Wine cellars that had been stocked by French aristocrats over generations were gradually consumed by British officers who treated the war as an extended hunting party with deadly serious consequences for everyone except themselves. Vintage champagnes were opened to celebrate minor tactical victories that had cost thousands of lives, creating a grotesque disconnect between the celebration and its cause. Perhaps nothing illustrated the disconnect between headquarters and the front lines more clearly than the language used to describe the war. And the comfortable offices of the chateau, military operations were discussed using euphemisms that drained them of all human content. Attacks that resulted in massive casualties were described as limited objective operations. The wholesale slaughter of infantry was referred to wastage, as if human lives were a resource to be expended like ammunition or fuel. And this sanitized language served a psychological function for the commanders who employed it. By reducing human suffering to abstract terminology, they could make decisions about life and death without confronting the emotional reality of what those decisions meant. A push that would cost 50,000 casualties could be planned and executed as if it were a chess move, with living, breathing human beings reduced to pieces on a board. The maps that covered the walls of the headquarters reinforced this abstraction. The Western Front was represented as a series of neat lines and symbols, with enemy positions marked in red and friendly forces in blue. There was no indication on these maps of the mud that made movement nearly impossible, the shell craters that turned simple advances into nightmarish obstacle courses, or the psychological toll that months of trench warfare had taken on the men who would be asked to carry out these operations. Staff officers who had spent months away from the actual fighting gradually lost touch with the reality of what they were planning. They began to think of warfare in terms of mathematical equations, so many men against so many enemy positions, with victory achievable through the application of sufficient force regardless of the human cost. While soldiers in the trenches slept sitting up in waterlogged dugouts, sharing their space with rats and lice, the generals occupied private suites that had been furnished with items transported from England specifically for their comfort. Haig's quarters included a 4-poster bed with fine linens, a private bathroom with hot running water, and a sitting room where he could receive visitors in comfort and privacy. Contrast extended to every aspect of daily life. While soldiers struggled to keep their feet dry and suffered from trench foot that literally rotted the flesh from their bones, generals maintained their health with regular baths, clean clothing that was laundered daily, and medical care that was immediate and comprehensive. A general who caught a cold would be attended by the finest doctors available, while soldiers with serious wounds might die for lack of basic medical supplies. The headquarters staff maintained a full complement of servants, orderlies, batmen, cooks and groundskeepers, who ensured that the general's daily routines proceeded without interruption. These servants were typically men who had been deemed too valuable for frontline service, or who had been wounded and reassigned to lighter duties. The irony was not lost on many of them. They had survived the trenches only to find themselves waiting on officers who had never experienced the reality of the war they were directing. Office space was seized in innumerable buildings for every imaginable military specialty: railroad operations, intelligence, gas warfare, sanitation, interpreters for the Indian Army and Chinese Labor Corps, as well as for the missions of the French, Italian and American forces. For many of the senior commanders, the war had become an intellectual exercise, a vast game of strategy that engaged their minds while remaining safely removed from their emotions. They studied the writings of military theorists, debated tactics with their staff officers, and planned operations with the detached precision of academics working on theoretical problems. General Haig was known to spend hours studying maps and reports, approaching military problems with the methodical thoroughness of a scholar. He kept detailed diaries in which he recorded his thoughts about strategy and tactics, writing with the confident tone of a man who believed that superior intellect and careful planning could overcome any obstacle. This intellectual approach to warfare allowed the generals to maintain their emotional equilibrium in the face of unprecedented casualties. By focusing on the abstract elements of strategy, supply lines, troop movements, artillery concentrations, they could avoid confronting the human reality of what their decisions meant for the men under their command. The planning sessions at headquarters resembled academic conferences more than military councils. Officers would present detailed analyses of previous operations, complete with charts and statistical breakdowns that reduced the slaughter to data points. These presentations were conducted with the same analytical rigor that might be applied to any other complex problem, creating an atmosphere of scholarly detachment that insulated the participants from the emotional impact of their work. The comfortable quarters and civilized routine of headquarters made it an attractive destination for politicians, journalists, and other dignitaries who wanted to experience the war without exposing themselves to actual danger. These visitors were treated to carefully orchestrated tours that reinforced the narrative of a well-managed conflict being conducted by competent professionals. Politicians arriving from London were housed in guest quarters that rivaled the finest hotels, with every comfort provided to ensure their visit was pleasant and memorable. They were briefed by staff officers who presented optimistic assessments of the war's progress, supported by carefully selected statistics and maps that emphasized successes while minimizing failures. Journalists were given similar treatment, with access to officers who could provide quotable material about the nobility of the cause and the competence of the leadership. These reporters rarely ventured close enough to the front lines to witness the reality of trench warfare, instead filing stories based on official briefings and staged demonstrations that bore little resemblance to actual combat conditions. The result was a steady stream of positive coverage that reinforced public support for the war while concealing its true cost. Newspaper readers at home were presented with images of confident commanders directing a righteous struggle for freedom and democracy, with little indication of the horrific conditions under which that struggle was being waged. To be fair to the generals who lived in such comfort while their men suffered in the trenches, many of them were not entirely oblivious to the contradiction of their situation. Private letters and diary entries reveal that some commanders struggled with the moral complexity of their position, recognizing that their comfort came at the cost of their soldiers' misery. And General Haig's personal correspondence shows a man who was genuinely concerned about the welfare of his troops, even as his tactical decisions sent hundreds of thousands of them to their deaths. He regularly visited hospitals behind the lines, where he saw firsthand the cost of his strategic choices. These visits clearly affected him, though he rarely allowed this emotional impact to influence his military planning. Other commanders dealt with the psychological burden of their position in different ways. Some threw themselves into the social life of headquarters, using dinner parties and ceremonial functions as distractions from the weight of their responsibilities. Others became increasingly isolated, spending long hours alone with their maps and reports, perhaps hoping that sufficient study could reveal some solution to the terrible equation of modern warfare. The burden of command in World War I was unlike anything military leaders had faced in previous conflicts. The scale of the casualties, the duration of the fighting, and the apparent futility of most operations created a psychological pressure that tested even the most experienced officers. Some broke under this pressure, suffering what would now be recognized as mental breakdowns brought on by the stress of sending vast numbers of men to their deaths. The correspondence between headquarters and the front lines reveals the profound disconnect between command and combat. Reports from battalion and company commanders in the trenches described conditions of almost unimaginable hardship. Men living in water, up to their waists, sharing their rations with rats, watching their comrades die from disease and exhaustion as well as enemy fire. These reports were received at headquarters and processed through multiple layers of staff officers, each of whom had a vested interest in presenting an optimistic assessment to their superiors. By the time information reached the senior commanders, it had been filtered and sanitized to remove most references to the human suffering that characterized life at the front. The generals' responses to these reports were typically focused on operational matters, requests for reinforcements, orders for new attacks, directives about supply arrangements. There was rarely any acknowledgement of the human cost described in the original reports, creating a correspondence that might have been discussing abstract military exercises rather than life and death struggles. When generals did write personally to subordinate commanders, their letters often reflected the comfortable world they inhabited rather than the harsh reality of the trenches. They might complain about minor inconveniences at headquarters, discuss social events, or share gossip from London, creating a jarring contrast with the desperate communications they received from the front lines. As the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, some observers began to question the moral legitimacy of a system that allowed commanders to live in luxury while their men died in squalor. Criticism came not just from pacifists and war opponents, but from serving officers who had experienced both worlds and found the contrast morally repugnant. Lieutenant Bernard Montgomery was also highly critical of his senior officers on the Western Front during the First World War. The higher staffs were out of touch with the regimental officers and with the troops. The former lived in comfort, which became greater as the distance of their headquarters behind the lines increased. There was no harm in this provided there was touch and sympathy between the staff and the troops. This was often lacking. The frightful casualties appalled me. This criticism was largely suppressed during the war itself, censored by military authorities who recognized that public knowledge of the contrast between command and combat would undermine support for the conflict. But after the war ended, memoirs and official histories began to reveal the extent of the disconnect, contributing to a post-war disillusionment that would shape attitudes toward military authority for generations. The moral questions raised by this contrast were profound and enduring. Was it acceptable for commanders to live in comfort while their men suffered? Did the isolation of headquarters from the reality of combat contribute to poor tactical decisions? Could the war have been conducted more effectively and more humanely if commanders had shared the risks and hardships of their troops? Perhaps most tragically, the comfortable isolation of World War I headquarters seemed to teach commanders very little about the reality of modern warfare. But despite 4 years of evidence that traditional tactics were inadequate against modern weapons, many generals continued to believe that sufficient determination and numerical superiority could overcome any defensive position. The Battle of the Somme, launched in July 1916, exemplified this disconnect. Planned in the comfortable offices of headquarters, the operation was based on assumptions about enemy defenses and British capabilities that bore little relation to battlefield reality. The result was 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, with minimal tactical gains to show for the sacrifice. Yet rather than questioning the fundamental assumptions that had led to this disaster, headquarters staff focused on technical adjustments, different artillery bombardment schedules, alternative infantry tactics, improved supply arrangements. The possibility that the entire strategic approach was flawed was rarely considered, perhaps because admitting such fundamental errors would have required confronting the human cost of the decisions that had been made in those comfortable chateau offices. This pattern repeated throughout the war, with each new offensive planned in isolation from the human reality of previous failures. The comfortable distance between headquarters and the front lines allowed commanders to maintain their faith in tactics that had proven repeatedly ineffective, leading to a grinding war of attrition that consumed millions of lives without achieving decisive results. In July-November 1916, he committed great masses of troops to an unsuccessful offensive on the Somme River, which cost 420,000 British casualties. Haig was steadfastly supported by King George V, but not by David Lloyd George, Prime Minister from December of that year. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister from 1916-1918, thought little of Haig and tried to undermine the Commander-in-Chief's authority. The wartime Prime Minister wrote that he sometimes wondered whether he should have resigned on more than one occasion rather than permit Haig to continue with his strategy. De Groot, a critical modern biographer of Haig, writes that Lloyd George's highly successful but hopelessly inaccurate war memoirs gave energy, respectability, and authority to the lions led by Donkey's school of thought. The term Chateau Generals came about at the end of WWI to help fix blame on the high death rates among soldiers on the battlefield. From my experience, being called a Chateau General is an insult. Its meaning carries a number of negative connotations, such as not caring for your followers, being overly concerned about your own personal well-being, and lacking in moral and physical courage. One historian writes that the Chateau General myth, put about in polemical memoirs, is in the main untrue. Haig did in fact visit units, although seldom when they were in the front line, training camps and even hospitals. However, the perception of disconnect remained powerful and influential in shaping post-war attitudes toward military leadership. The physical separation between headquarters and combat zones was not merely a matter of safety, but reflected deeper assumptions about the nature of command and the social hierarchy of the military. The British Army of World War I remained deeply influenced by class distinctions that had shaped the service for centuries. Officers were drawn primarily from the upper classes, educated at public schools and universities that emphasized classical learning rather than practical military skills. This background had served adequately in colonial conflicts where British forces enjoyed overwhelming technological and organizational advantages, but proved less suitable for the industrial warfare of the Western Front. The generals who commanded from their chateau had been shaped by an educational system that valued theoretical knowledge over practical experience, abstract thinking over hands-on problem solving. They approached military problems with the same methods they had learned for analyzing classical texts or philosophical arguments, seeking solutions through careful study and logical reasoning rather than direct observation and experimentation. This intellectual approach had obvious benefits, allowing for careful planning and systematic analysis of complex problems. But it also created a dangerous disconnect from the messy, chaotic reality of actual combat. The social rituals that continued at headquarters throughout the war served multiple functions beyond mere entertainment. They provided a way for commanders to maintain their sense of identity and purpose in the face of an unprecedented and morally challenging situation. By preserving the forms of civilized society, even in the midst of mechanized slaughter, the generals could convince themselves that they were defending something worthwhile, rather than simply presiding over mass destruction. The elaborate dinners, formal ceremonies, and careful observance of social protocols created a bubble of normalcy that insulated commanders from the full horror of what they were orchestrating. These rituals also served to reinforce the hierarchical structure that kept decision-making power concentrated in the hands of a small group of senior officers. By maintaining the social distinctions that had always characterized British society, the military hierarchy ensured that critical decisions would be made by men who shared common backgrounds, assumptions, and values. This homogeneity of command had benefits in terms of unity of purpose and clarity of communication, but it also meant that alternative perspectives and innovative approaches were systematically excluded from the decision-making process. The technological innovations that transformed warfare during World War I created new challenges for commanders who had been trained for a different kind of conflict. The machine guns, poison gas, aircraft, and improved artillery required new tactics and new forms of organization that traditional military education had not anticipated. Yet many senior commanders remained committed to approaches that had worked in previous wars, convinced that fundamental principles of warfare remained unchanged despite technological advances. This conservatism was reinforced by the comfortable isolation of headquarters, where the impact of new weapons was experienced only as statistical abstractions rather than lived reality. The distance between headquarters and the front lines also created practical problems for military planning and execution. Communications technology of the early 20th century was inadequate for the complex coordination required by modern warfare. Telephone lines were frequently cut by artillery fire, radio technology was primitive and unreliable, and messenger services were slow and dangerous. This meant that headquarters often operated with outdated information about battlefield conditions, making decisions based on assumptions about situations that had changed hours or even days earlier. The result was a chronic mismatch between planned operations and battlefield reality that contributed to many of the tactical failures that characterized the war. The medical services provide another example of how the distance between command and combat affected the war effort. Their generals who lived in comfortable quarters with immediate access to the best medical care available often failed to appreciate the challenges faced by medical personnel working close to the front lines. Their field hospitals operated under conditions that would have been considered inadequate for treating animals in peacetime. Yet commanders continued to plan operations without adequate consideration for casualty evacuation and treatment. The result was unnecessary suffering and death among wounded soldiers who might have been saved with better planning and resource allocation. The contrast between headquarters comfort and frontline suffering was particularly stark when it came to food and nutrition. While generals enjoyed elaborate meals prepared by skilled chefs using the finest ingredients available, frontline troops subsisted on monotonous rations that were often inadequate in both quantity and quality. This disparity had practical as well as moral implications, as malnourished soldiers were more susceptible to disease and less capable of the physical exertion required by combat operations. Yet headquarters planning rarely gave adequate attention to logistic support for frontline troops, focusing instead on the movement of men and equipment needed for offensive operations. The psychological impact of this disconnect extended far beyond the immediate participants. Families at home gradually became aware of the contrast between official accounts of the war and the reality described in letters from the front. This awareness contributed to a growing cynicism about military and political leadership that would have lasting effects on British society. The credibility gap created by the difference between headquarters propaganda and battlefield reality undermined public trust in institutions that had previously commanded automatic respect and deference. The international dimension of the war created additional complications for British commanders operating from their comfortable headquarters. Coordination with French, Belgian, and later American forces required diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity that many British generals lacked. The comfortable isolation of headquarters made it easy for British commanders to maintain an attitude of superiority toward their allies, contributing to tensions that sometimes undermined military cooperation. The assumption that British methods and British leadership were inherently superior was reinforced by the social environment of headquarters, where such attitudes went unchallenged by alternative perspectives. The economic costs of maintaining elaborate headquarters establishments represented a significant drain on resources that might have been better used to support frontline troops. The staff, servants, and facilities required to maintain the comfortable lifestyle of senior commanders consumed scarce supplies and diverted personnel from more essential military functions. While these costs were relatively small compared to the overall expense of the war, they represented a misallocation of priorities that reflected broader problems with military leadership and organization. When the armistice finally came in November 1918, the contrast between headquarters and the front lines persisted even in victory. While soldiers in the trenches celebrated with whatever food and drink they could find, officers at headquarters marked the occasion with formal dinners, featuring the finest cuisine and wines that wartime conditions had allowed them to procure. The post-war period brought a reckoning for this disparity, though it was often indirect and incomplete. Many of the generals who had lived so comfortably during the war found their reputations tarnished by the enormous casualties their tactics had produced. Public opinion, once supportive of military leadership, became increasingly critical as the full cost of the war became apparent. Yet, many of these same commanders received honors and pensions that reflected their elevated status during the conflict, retiring to comfortable estates while their former subordinates struggled with war wounds, unemployment, and the psychological scars of their service. The disconnect between command and combat, which had characterized the war itself, persisted into the peace that followed. Haig was also awarded a grant of £100,000 by the government. He was made an earl in 1919, and then Baron Haig of Bemiside in 1921. Despite the criticism, Haig dedicated the remainder of his life to service in the Royal British Legion, which he helped to establish, caring for the welfare of the troops who served under him during the war. The legacy of World War I headquarters culture extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the conflict. The image of chateau generals living in comfort while their men died in squalor became a powerful symbol of military incompetence and moral failure that would influence public attitudes toward military leadership for generations. That this symbolism was not entirely fair to individual commanders, many of whom were competent professionals doing their best under impossible circumstances, but it reflected genuine concerns about the relationship between privilege and responsibility, between decision-making power and personal risk. The lessons of World War I headquarters culture had implications that extended far beyond military affairs. The war demonstrated how physical and social distance between leaders and those affected by their decisions could lead to poor judgment and moral blindness. This insight would prove relevant to many other areas of human activity. From business management to political governance, the concept of leading from the front became a powerful counter-narrative to the Chateau General model, emphasizing the importance of shared risk and direct experience in effective leadership. Some military leaders learned these lessons and applied them in subsequent conflicts. During World War II, many commanders made deliberate efforts to spend time with frontline troops and to share at least some of the risks and hardships of combat. This approach had both practical and symbolic benefits, improving the quality of military decision-making while also maintaining morale and unit cohesion. However, the tendency toward isolation and comfort remained a persistent temptation for military leaders, particularly as conflicts became larger and more complex. The technological advances that have occurred since World War I have in some ways made the problem of command isolation more severe. Modern communication systems allow commanders to monitor battlefield conditions in real time from great distances, creating the illusion of direct involvement while maintaining physical separation from actual combat. The challenge for modern military leaders is to use these technologies to enhance rather than replace direct contact with frontline troops and battlefield conditions. As we prepare to conclude our journey through the Great War, let us reflect on this final contrast between those who decided and those who died, between those who planned and those who paid. The comfortable chateau where generals lived during World War I serve as monuments to the distance that can exist between power and its consequences, between decision and suffering. This distance was not merely a matter of physical miles, though 20 miles separated headquarters from the front lines. It was a psychological and moral distance that allowed intelligent, well-meaning men to make decisions that caused unprecedented human suffering while living lives of relative comfort and safety. Perhaps most importantly, this distance reminds us that in any conflict, we must ask not just whether the cause is just, but whether those who decide to fight are prepared to share the risks they ask others to bear. The generals of World War I were products of their time and class, operating within systems and assumptions that they had inherited rather than chosen. That their example serves as a warning about the moral hazards of leadership that is insulated from the consequences of its own decisions. Paul Fussell, a literary historian, writes, "Although one doesn't want to be too hard on Haig, who has been well calumniated already, it must be said that it now appears the war was testing the usefulness of the earnest Scottish character in a situation demanding the military equivalent of wit and invention. Haig had none. He was stubborn, self-righteous, inflexible, intolerant, especially of the French, and quite humorless." The story of World War I headquarters culture is ultimately a story about the human capacity for moral blindness and self-deception. It demonstrates how good intentions and genuine patriotism can be corrupted by privilege and isolation, leading to decisions that cause immense suffering while allowing those responsible to maintain their sense of righteousness and moral clarity. This is not a problem unique to military commanders or to World War I, but rather a persistent challenge in any situation where some people have the power to make decisions that primarily affect others. As you settle into sleep tonight, in your own comfortable bed, far from the mud and terror of those long-ago trenches, remember both the soldiers who suffered and the commanders who ordered their suffering. Remember the Christmas truce that showed humanity's capacity for peace, the gas attacks that revealed our capacity for cruelty, and the comfortable headquarters that demonstrated our capacity for moral blindness. The Great War ended more than a century ago, but its lessons about the distance between power and consequence, between decision and suffering, remain as relevant today as they were when those generals sat in their chateau, planning operations they would never have to execute, ordering advances they would never have to make, sending men to die in trenches they would never have to call home. The ultimate tragedy of World War I was not just the enormous loss of life, but the waste of human potential and the betrayal of trust between leaders and led. The soldiers who died in the trenches had placed their faith in commanders who promised that their sacrifices would serve a greater purpose. The commanders who lived in chateaux had accepted responsibility for lives they never fully understood or adequately valued. The distance between these two worlds, physical and moral, represents one of the most enduring lessons of the Great War, a reminder that true leadership requires not just authority and intelligence, but empathy, humility, and the courage to share the risks that others are asked to bear. Conclusion. As you settle into sleep tonight, in your own comfortable bed, far from the mud and terror of those long-ago trenches, remember both the soldiers who suffered and the commanders who ordered their suffering. Remember the Christmas truce that showed humanity's capacity for peace, the gas attacks that revealed our capacity for cruelty, and the comfortable headquarters that demonstrated our capacity for moral blindness. The Great War ended more than a century ago, but its lessons about the distance between power and consequence, between decision and suffering, remain as relevant today as they were when those generals sat in their chateau, planning operations they would never have to execute, ordering advances they would never have to make, sending men to die in trenches they would never have to call home.